The wall had a sound that no one who had never stood beneath it could properly describe to those who had not. It was not silence. Silence implied an absence of noise, a neutral quiet that carried no weight. What the wall produced was older than silence. It was the sound of something immense and ancient simply existing, pressing down on every living thing within its shadow, like a held breath that had lasted 8,000 years. Jon Snow had stood beneath it for months and had never once stopped hearing it. He stopped hearing it the morning he walked away. The decision had not come in a single moment. That was the lie men told themselves about breaking. That there was one instant, one unbearable thing, one final straw that snapped the will cleanly in two. The truth was messier. And as truth always was, in a world that ground men to powder between the stones of duty and love, Jon had received Bran's raven first, then Robb's written in his brother's careful hand, words chosen to avoid saying directly what they said directly. Father is taken. Joffrey sits the throne. We have no friends in King's Landing. Then a merchant's gossip passed through Castle Black like plague. Not the Raven official account, but the street version, the version that traveled faster because it did not require a maester's discretion. Ned Stark was in the black cells. The charge was treason. The new king was not yet 15 and was already speaking about making examples. Jon had stood at the wall's base and listened to its ancient, pressurized quiet and understood one thing, with the certainty that bypassed argument. His father was going to die in a dungeon beneath a city built on lies, and the Night's Watch would watch it happen from 800 miles north with profound and honorable regret. He left before the sun cleared the eastern hills. He took Longclaw. He left a letter for Lord Commander Mormont that said everything and asked forgiveness for none of it, because asking forgiveness for choosing your father over your vows felt obscene in a way he could not fully articulate. Ghost followed him to the gate and stopped there, red eyes holding Jon's gray ones across a distance that felt like prophecy. Jon looked at the dire wolf for a long moment, at the white fur that the wall's eternal shadow had turned silver. When at the stillness of an animal that understood things, human minds translated too slowly. Stay, he said. The word tasted like every vow he was breaking. Ghost stayed. Jon Snow walked south and then east, and then onto a ship at Eastwatch by the Sea, whose captain asked no questions that the right number of coins didn't answer. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, or in this case, step outside the paths history assigned them, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. All men must die, but legends endure. The narrow sea was not kind to a man carrying guilt as ballast. The crossing from Eastwatch took 8 days on a vessel that smelled of salted fish and old rope, recruited by men whose faces suggested they had all done things that would not survive the light of a Godswood's red leaves. Jon spent most of the crossing at the prow, watching the water change color from the gray-green of the northern coast to the deeper blue that belonged to Essos. He had grown up hearing about the free cities the way all Westerosi children did, as abstract places, distant and exotic, where the rules of Westeros did not apply. He understood now that this was the point. He needed a place where the rules did not apply, where a bastard with a Valyrian steel sword and no house name and no Night's Watch vows was simply a man with a sword, and what that man did with it was determined by him alone. Her Pentos announced itself with smell before sight, spices and offal, and the particular warm rot of a city that had been built too close to the water and had never quite made peace with the decision. The harbor was chaos compared to anything Jon had known north of the Neck. Galleys from Volantis with their red-lacquered oars, flat-bottomed Dothraki trade barges stacked with eastern goods, fishing vessels that looked as though they were kept afloat primarily through the optimism of their crews. The dockside was louder than a battle and smelled nearly as bad. Jon stepped onto Pentoshi soil with 43 silver stags, Longclaw on his back, and no plan beyond the next hour. The plan for the next hour was to find information. He found it, as men in port cities always found information, in a tavern that existed specifically for the purpose of selling it alongside the wine. It was called, with the unironic directness of Essosi commerce, the Open Ear, and it served a dark Pentoshi wine that tasted like blackberries and regret. Jon sat in a corner and listened to three conversations simultaneously and drank half his cup and learned the following. A Westerosi merchant consortium had arrived 2 days ago with news from King's Landing that was causing considerable commercial nervousness among the magisters. The hand of the king, the Lord Stark, a man of considerable northern reputation, had been arrested for treason against the crown. His fate was uncertain. His daughters were at court. His sons were reportedly mobilizing in the north. Reportedly mobilizing, which meant they had not yet moved. Which meant time was still a resource Jon possessed, if barely. It was in the open ear that he first heard the Wolfpack mentioned, and it was in the particular way that Pentoshi merchants mentioned them, in lowered voices, with a specific quality of fear that is not theatrical but functional, that Jon understood they were worth finding. The merchant who let the name slip was a fat man in a yellow robe, speaking to a companion about a failed caravan route near the Rhoyne. The Wolfpack hit the escort between Goyandro and the old way station, left the guards breathing. They always leave them breathing, but stripped the cargo clean. 23 men, and they moved like one animal. His companion had asked how many in the pack. The fat merchant had shrugged. Enough. Jon had spent enough time at Castle Black among rangers who understood threat assessment to recognize the difference between brigands and something organized enough to be useful. He spent 2 days and 16 silver stags finding them. The contact chain moved through a Pentoshi spice broker who owed money to a Westerosi exile who drank at a particular dockside establishment on even-numbered evenings, and who, when Jon sat down across from him and placed Longclaw flat on the table so the Valyrian steel's faint shimmer was visible in the lamplight, had looked at the sword for a long moment and then looked at Jon and said, "You're young to be carrying something like that." "My father gave it to me," Jon had said, which was almost true in all the ways that mattered. "Where's your father now?" "King's Landing. Black cells. That's why I'm here." Andre, the exile, a man named Peck, who had the kind of face that suggested a history of arriving at things slightly too late, had studied Jon across the table with the calculating patience of a man who had survived by reading situations accurately. "The Wolfpack doesn't do rescues," he said finally. "Not yet," Jon said. The torchlight in the open ear moved across Longclaw's pommel, the white wolf's head carved there, ghost rendered in pale stone, and Peck had watched it with something shifting behind his eyes. "I'll get a message to Aldrich," he said. "What he does with it is his business." Jon had nodded and finished his wine and returned to the narrow room he'd rented above a tanner's workshop, where the smell of curing hides came through the floorboards like a persistent memory. When he had lain awake listening to Pentos's nighttime sounds. So different from Castle Black's windscour, so different from Winterfell's settled quiet, and thought about his father sitting in the dark below the Red Keep. Ned Stark had taught him that honor was not a convenience. It was not something you practiced when it cost nothing and set aside when the price rose. Honor was specifically the thing you held to when everything around you was trying to get you to let go. Jon understood this. He had believed it the way you believe things you had been raised inside of, the way you believed in the cold because you had always lived in it. Walking away from the wall had not shaken that belief, but it had made him understand something his father's lessons had not quite prepared him for. That honor by itself was not a rescue plan. He was going to need wolves for that. Aldrich Grey did not come to Jon. He sent a location, scratched on a strip of leather that Peck delivered without ceremony or explanation, dropped on the table beside Jon's wine cup, like a man discarding something he no longer wanted to be associated with. The leather said in a hand that had clearly learned its letters from someone who considered writing a functional skill rather than an art, "Old Olive Press, South Wall. Come before the second bell or don't come." Jon came before the second bell. The olive press was a ruin in the way that things in Pentos were ruins, not collapsed and forgotten but repurposed, its original function absorbed into the city's endless commercial metabolism. The grinding stones were still there, massive and dark with decades of oil stain, but the space around them had been converted into something between a barracks and a butcher's workshop. Bedrolls on the stone floor. Weapons stacked with the casual organization of men who expected to need them quickly. The smell of steel oil and cook fire smoke, and the particular human musk of people who spent most of their lives outdoors and bathed when the weather permitted it. There were 11 of them visible when Jon entered. He suspected there were more he couldn't see. Aldrich Grey was not what the fat merchant's frightened voice had suggested. Jon had built a mental image on the walk over. Something monstrous, barrel-chested, the kind of physical intimidation that made men lower their voices when they said a name. What he found was a man perhaps 40 years old, lean in the way that suggested all excess had been burned away by years of hard living, with close-cropped gray hair that contradicted a face younger than it should have been. He sat on one of the grinding stones eating an apple with a short knife, watching Jon cross the threshold with eyes the color of old ash. He did not stand. He did not offer greeting. He looked at Jon the way a man looked at a horse he was considering purchasing, thoroughly without sentiment, searching for the hidden flaw that the seller was hoping you'd miss. "Peck says you want to go back to Westeros," Aldrich said. His accent was curious. Westerosi underneath, northern underneath that, but smoothed by years of Essosi, living into something that belonged entirely to neither place. "Peck says you want to go to King's Landing specifically. Through it, there's actually, through it," Jon confirmed, "to pull a man out of the black cells." "My father." Aldrich took a bite of his apple and chewed it thoughtfully. Around him, the 11 visible members of the wolf pack had not moved, had not arranged themselves into any posture of threat or welcome, simply continued what they'd been doing. Sharpening blades, repairing leather, sleeping, with the practiced indifference of people who had learned that most strangers were either harmless or manageable. "Your father," Aldrich repeated. "And who is your father, boy, that he's worth crossing the narrow sea and walking into Cersei Lannister's city to retrieve?" "Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell, Warden of the North." The olive press went quiet in the specific way that spaces go quiet when everyone in them stops pretending not to listen. Aldrich looked at Jon for a long moment. Then he looked at Longclaw, at the white wolf pommel, at the faint shimmer of Valyrian steel in the press's torchlight. Then he looked back at Jon's face with an expression that had shifted from commercial assessment to something more complicated. "Ned Stark's bastard," he said. "Not cruel, simply accurate, the way a ranger named terrain." "Jon Snow," Jon said. "Jon Snow," Aldrich agreed. He finished his apple and set the core carefully on the grinding stone beside him and folded his knife closed. "I knew a man from the north, long time ago, served under your father's father, Rickard Stark, before everything went wrong with the Mad King. Good man, the kind that Westeros eats." He paused. "Most good men are." "My father is still alive," Jon said. "I intend to keep him that way." "For now," Aldrich said. "How long has he been in the black cells?" "Weeks. The merchant news is running behind. I don't have an exact count, which means I have less time than I think I do." Aldrich nodded slowly, the nod of a man processing operational information rather than expressing agreement. He stood from the grinding stone. He was shorter than Jon had expected, perhaps 2 inches shorter than Jon himself, which somehow made him feel more dangerous rather than less, the way compact things have stored force more efficiently than sprawling ones. "The wolf pack doesn't do rescues," he said. "You've probably heard that." "I've heard it," Jon said. "I've also heard you hit a 23-man escort between Goyandro and the Royne way station and left every guard breathing. That's not brigandry, that's precision." Men who work with that kind of precision can be convinced to expand their definition of what they do." Something moved at the corner of Aldrich's mouth that was not quite a smile. "You're going to tell me why we should want to," he said. It was not a question. Jon had spent the 2 days of searching thinking about exactly this. He had no house to offer, no gold beyond what remained of his 43 stags, no political connections in Essos, no leverage, no promises he could back with anything institutional. What he had was Longclaw, a name that meant something in the north, and the truth, which in Westeros was nearly worthless, but in a place like the Wolfpack, among men who had abandoned every comfortable lie, might carry unexpected weight. "In Ned Stark is the last man of genuine authority in Westeros who would actually do what he said he'd do," Jon said. "Every lord left plays the game. Promises made and broken, alliances bought and sold, Guest right violated at supper tables. My father's the one who is going to die because he wouldn't play along. There are men in this room. He looked around at the 11 who had stopped pretending not to listen, who left Westeros because of what the game does to people, who watched lords like Tywin Lannister and Littlefinger turn honor into a weapon used against the men who actually had it. My father is what's left of something that used to mean something. When Joffrey takes his head, that thing dies with him. The olive press was very quiet. "That's a speech," said a woman's voice from the shadows near the far wall. See, Jon had not registered her. She had been sitting completely still in a way that suggested long practice at being unregistered. She was perhaps 30, dark-skinned in the manner of someone from the Summer Isles or Nath, with close-cropped hair and a pair of short blades crossed on her back. "It's a good speech. It doesn't answer why we should risk our necks for Westerosi politics." "Aura," Aldrich said, with the tone of a man who had learned not to try to stop a particular river from running, but could occasionally redirect it. "He needs to answer it," Aura said unintentionally. "He knows he needs to answer it." She was right. Jon knew it. "I can't pay you what this is worth in coin," he said directly. "I have enough silver left to buy passage and provisions, and not much beyond. What I can offer is this." He reached back and drew Longclaw, not in threat but in demonstration, letting the blade catch the torchlight fully. The Valyrian steel did what Valyrian steel always did in firelight. It seemed to drink the light rather than reflect it, darker than it should have been at its core, shimmering at its edges. "This blade is worth more than most lords see in a year of rents. If we get my father out and reach to safety, it's yours. All of yours. Sell it, melt it. Whatever Valyrian steel is worth to men with the right contacts in Qohor." The silence that followed was different from the previous one. This one had weight in it. Valyrian steel was not a commodity in any ordinary sense. There were fewer than 200 Valyrian steel blades in the known world, and most of them were locked in the vaults of great houses. The idea of one changing hands in a ruined olive press in Pentos for a rescue job was the kind of thing that made practical men recalculate very quickly. "You'd give up your father's sword," Aldrich said slowly, "to save your father." "He'd tell me I was being an idiot," Jon said. "He'd be right. I don't care." Aldrich looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at Aura. Then he looked around at the rest of the pack, at the faces that had turned from their tasks, at the particular quality of attention that meant men who lived by reading situations were reading this one with considerable focus. "We're not doing this for the sword," Aldrich said finally. "The sword is—" He paused, choosing, "The sword is a number. It tells me you're serious. It doesn't tell me you're capable." He met Jon's eyes. "You want to run this with us? You prove you run at pack speed, not Stark speed, not Night's Watch speed. Ours." He gestured at the space around them, the bedrolls, the weapons, the grinding stones darkened by 100 years of labor. "Stay. 3 days. Show me what you can do and how you learn what you can't. Then we talk about King's Landing." Jon resheathed Longclaw and nodded once. 3 days, he said. Outside, Pentos hummed and stank and went about its business, indifferent to what was being decided in its ruins. Somewhere across the narrow sea in a cell beneath the Red Keep, Ned Stark sat in darkness that his honor had built around him, patient as the North itself, waiting for something he would never think to wait for. His bastard son, a pack of exiled wolves, point in a plan that depended entirely on becoming the thing Westeros had always tried to make him. A man willing to do what needed doing, honor or no. The olive press torches guttered in a draft from the south-facing gap in the wall. Jon Snow sat down on the floor across from Aldrich Grey and waited for morning to show him what wolves required of those who wanted to run with them. The first day, they did not let him fight. This was the thing Jon had not anticipated, that the wolf pack's assessment would begin not with blades but with observation, the way a hunting animal circles something new in its territory before deciding what category it belonged to. He had expected tests of skill, the kind of trial-by-combat logic that governed every institution he had ever belonged to, from Winterfell's yard to Castle Black's training ground. Instead, Aldrich set him to work alongside the pack in their daily operations, and watched him the way a maester watched a patient. not for what the patient said about themselves, but for what they revealed without meaning to. The morning was logistics. The wolf pack was preparing a supply cache along a road northeast of Pentos, the kind of unglamorous operational work that kept a mobile unit alive between contracts. Jon carried, loaded, organized, and listened. He listened the way Jon Stark had taught him to listen in the field. Not for content, but for pattern, for the way a group of people talked around a leader versus to him, for the fault lines of personality that became critical when everything went wrong. What he found surprised him. The Wolfpack was not a mercenary company in any structure he recognized. There was no clear rank below Aldrich, no sergeants, no designated seconds. Instead, there was something more fluid and more stable simultaneously. A web of specific competencies that everyone in the pack knew instinctively, so that in any situation, the person most suited to the immediate problem naturally moved to the front without discussion or ceremony. Aura handled anything requiring silence and precision. A massive Carthian man named Darrow managed anything involving physical force or intimidation. A small, quick-fingered Lysini woman called Mira, who spoke 6 languages and seemed constitutionally incapable of being noticed, handled information and access. An older Westerosi man named Cass, who moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing an old injury, handled planning and contingency. Jon watched them work through the morning and understood 2 things. First, this was the most functionally competent small unit he had ever observed, including the Night's Watch Rangers, who had seemed like the ceiling of what organized men could accomplish outside a formal army. Second, he did not yet know where he fit in it, and neither did they, and that uncertainty was the actual test. The afternoon brought the first edge of something harder. Aldrich sent Jon with Aura to collect a debt from a Pentoshi wool merchant who had shorted the pack on payment for a previous job. The nature of the job was not explained, and Jon did not ask. He had learned enough in 2 days to understand that the Wolfpack's economy of information was precise, or that you were told what you needed for your specific task, and the larger picture assembled itself or didn't, depending on what you deserved to know yet. The wool merchant's warehouse was in the middle ring of Pentos, where the smell of the harbor faded into the smell of commerce. Dye works and timber yards and the dusty sweetness of stored grain. The merchant himself was a small man with the specific energy of someone who had built a comfortable life through a series of careful betrayals and had convinced himself this was simply good business. He saw Aura and went pale in a way that suggested their previous interaction had left an impression. Jon stood back and watched Aura work. She did not threaten. She did not raise her voice. She sat down uninvited across from the merchant in his own office and spoke to him in low, even Pentoshi, and the merchant nodded repeatedly with the compulsive nodding of a man who has recognized that the conversation has already ended and is simply waiting for the other person to leave. Aura stood, pocketed something, coin, Jon assumed, and walked out without looking back. In the street, Jon fell into step beside her. "You didn't need me there," he said. "No," Aura agreed. "Aldrich sent me anyway." "Yes." Jon considered this. He wanted to see if I'd ask why. Aura glanced at him sideways, the first time she had looked at him with anything other than flat assessment. "Most Westerosi lordlings ask why before they finish sitting down," she said. "They need the architecture, the reasons. They want to understand the hierarchy so they know where they stand in it." "I grew up a bastard," Jon said. "The bastards learn to find where they stand without being told." Aura said nothing for a moment. They moved through the Pentoshi market street, past stalls selling Eastern spices and bolts of Mirish lace and small cages of birds, whose colors had no equivalent in any Westerosi landscape Jon knew. "The pack has had Westerosi before," she said finally. "They come in one of 2 shapes, the ones who can't stop being what Westeros made them. Lord's son, Knight Squire, Sworn Sword. They carry it like a hump. It slows them down and eventually gets them killed or gets someone else killed. And then there are the ones who came to Essos specifically because Westeros broke something in them that they're glad to have broken." She paused. "Aldrich wants to know which shape you are." "I'm neither," Jon said. "Masha, everyone says that." "I came here for my father," Jon said. "Not because Westeros broke me, Not because I'm running from what I was made there. I'm going back when this is done. He paused. If there's something to go back to. Aura stopped walking. She turned and looked at him with the full weight of her attention for the first time, and Jon understood that this was a different quality of scrutiny from anything the morning had involved. Not the pack assessing a potential asset, but a person deciding something about another person. You actually believe that, she said. It was not quite a question. Yes. That's either very strong or very stupid, she said. In my experience, those are the same thing at different speeds. She turned and kept walking. Don't tell Aldrich I said that. Ooh, he'll make it into a lesson. The second day brought the fight Jon had been expecting. It came from a pack member he hadn't cataloged yet. A young man perhaps Jon's own age, Westerosi by the sound of him, with the broad shoulders and broken nose of someone who had spent significant time being hit and had decided to become very good at it in response. His name was Edwin, and he had been watching Jon with the specific hostility of someone whose position in a hierarchy feels threatened by a new arrival, which Jon recognized because he had spent his entire childhood navigating the same dynamic in Winterfell's yard. Edwin came at him after the evening meal in the cleared space between the grinding stones that apparently served as the pack's informal training ground. He came without warning, not from behind, not treacherously, but without the courtesy of announcement that Westerosi sparring protocol demanded. One moment Jon was cleaning his eating knife, and the next Edwin was moving at him with a short blade already drawn, fast and low and committed. Jon dropped the knife and moved. He didn't draw a long claw. The calculation was instantaneous and not entirely conscious. Drawing a Valyrian steel blade against a pack member in a training context would be the kind of statement that closed doors rather than opened them. Instead, he let Edwin's momentum carry past him, redirected the blade arm with both hands, and put Edwin on the stone floor with a joint lock that the younger man broke almost immediately. He was strong and technically capable, better than most of the junior rangers Jon had trained with at the wall. They went 3 passes. And Jon took a cut along his left forearm on the second, shallow, more humiliating than dangerous. And on the third, he got inside Edwin's guard and put his elbow against the young man's throat with enough controlled pressure to make the choice clear without making it permanent. Edwin went still. Jon stepped back. The pack was watching. Aldrich was watching from his grinding stone with the expression of a man seeing something he expected, but was nonetheless interested in the specifics of. You didn't draw, Edwin said, sitting up and touching his throat with his fingertips. No, Jon said. Why? Because I'm a guest, Jon said. Until I'm not. Edwin looked at him for a moment. Something in his expression recalibrated. Not warmth, not yet, but the specific recalibration of someone who has tested a thing and found it different from what they assumed. You're bleeding, Edwin said, with something that was almost embarrassed. I've bled before, Jon said. Aldrich spoke from his grinding stone without changing his posture. Mira, he said, show him where we keep the wrappings. A pause, the weight of a man delivering a verdict he'd been building toward for 2 days. He runs with us. The third day was planning. Cass spread a rough map on the floor of the olive press. Not a maester's careful cartography, but a working document, hand-drawn from memory and corrected in multiple inks over what appeared to be years of use. King's Landing was rendered in the pragmatic shorthand of someone who had been there operationally rather than as a subject or a tourist. The harbor approach, like the city's 3 main gates, the layout of the Street of Steel relative to the Red Keep's outer walls, the approximate position of the black cells relative to the dungeon's drainage system. Jon stared at the map and felt something shift in his chest. Not hope exactly, but the thing that preceded hope in men who had learned to be careful with it. The sewers, he said. The sewers, Cass confirmed, with the satisfaction of a man whose expertise was being recognized. King's Landing was built on a hill over a river tributary that was diverted when Aegon's builders needed the land. The old water channels run under the lower city and connect to the Red Keep's waste drainage. Most of the access points are in the lower city. Flea Bottom, the Street of Flower, the Tanner's District. He pointed with a blunt finger. The black cells are in the deepest part of the Keep's foundation. Their drainage runs south. The access point in Flea Bottom, Jon said, leaning forward. How close does it get? Within 40 feet of the outer black cell wall, Cass said. We've never used it for extraction. It was surveyed for a different job 3 years ago, but the passage holds. Jon straightened up and looked at Aldrich. We need to know if he's still alive, and he said, before anything else, we go in on bad intelligence and we're moving through the Red Keep's underbelly looking for a dead man. Agreed, Aldrich said. That's what the next part of the planning is for. He looked at Mira, who was already unfolding a separate piece of paper with a particular expression of someone who had been waiting for the conversation to reach her specialty. Mira has contacts in King's Landing, a spice merchant on the Street of Steel who deals in information as a secondary commodity. We can have confirmation within a week if we move now. We move now, Jon said. No one disagreed. Around the olive press, the wolf pack began, in its quiet and competent way, to prepare for a crossing that every practical instinct they collectively possessed argued against. A mission into the most politically dangerous city in the known world, through its sewers, for a man none of them had ever met, commissioned by a bastard with a Valyrian steel sword and a look in his eyes that Aldrich had seen before, on men who had already decided what they were willing to pay and were simply working out the logistics of paying it. Outside, Pentos went about its warm and indifferent business. The narrow sea waited. Ned Stark sat in his darkness and did not know that wolves were coming. The ship that carried them west was called the Salted Crow, a Bravosi merchant vessel whose captain, a weathered woman named Vessa, had the kind of face that suggested she had heard every lie a passenger had ever told and had long since stopped finding them interesting. She asked no questions about the 11 people and their weapons who came aboard at Pentos' eastern dock in the gray hour before full dawn. She asked about coin. The coin was provided. The Salted Crow pushed off from the Pentoshi dock as the city's morning bells began their argument with each other across the rooftops, and the narrow sea opened ahead of them like a held question. Jon stood at the stern and watched Pentos shrink into the coastline's haze and thought about the last time he had crossed this water. 8 days eastward, carrying guilt and desperation and 43 silver stags. He was returning with less coin and considerably more company, and the desperation had not diminished, but had been organized into something that functioned better under pressure. Purpose, perhaps, or the closest thing to it that a man could assemble from the materials available. Cass found him at the stern on the second morning with a cup of something hot that tasted approximately like tea if tea had been raised in difficult circumstances. I've been thinking about the timing problem, Cass said, settling against the rail with the careful movement of his managed injury. An old wound to his hip that Jon had diagnosed as a poorly healed sword thrust, something that had changed the way Cass moved through the world, but had not clearly convinced him to move through less of it. The black cells have a guard rotation. Standard city watch. 4 men at the entrance to the lower cells, 2 at the cell block itself, rotating every 6 hours. The problem isn't getting through the sewer access. The problem is the 40 feet between the access point and the outer cell wall. That stretch is open storage. Barrels, old timber, tools. Cover exists, but it's not guaranteed, and if a guard comes through on an off-rotation check, we need a distraction, Jon said. We need a significant distraction, Cass said. Something that pulls the off-rotation guards toward the surface. Something that feels like a genuine emergency rather than a staged one. Because city watchmen have seen staged emergencies, and their response to those is to send one man and be suspicious. Jon wrapped both hands around his cup and looked at the water. The narrow sea in autumn had a particular quality of gray. Not the bleak gray of the northern coast, but a deeper, more complicated gray. The color of things that contained more than they showed on the surface. Riot, Jon said. Cass raised an eyebrow. Not a true riot, Jon said, but something close enough that the watch can't afford to ignore it. Flea Bottom is... It doesn't take much. A fire in the wrong place, a grain store conflict. Something that pulls the gold cloaks out of the keep's lower levels toward the city. A fire in Flea Bottom, Cass said slowly, working through it. During the watch's second rotation, which puts it at dusk, when the streets are crowded enough that the panic reads as genuine, would require at minimum 2 pack members to maintain it long enough to be convincing, which means we go in with 9. 8, Jon said. I go for my father. I need one person who knows the passage with me. 7, maintaining the distraction and the perimeter, Cass said. He was quiet for a moment, the way planners went quiet when they were running probabilities that didn't fully resolve. It's thin. Everything about this is thin, Jon said. And Cass considered this with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had been on thin operations before and had survived them through a combination of competence and the particular stubbornness that survivors developed as a coping mechanism. Aura goes in with you, Cass said. She's the only one who can move through a confined space quietly enough to make the 40 feet workable. Jon nodded. He had already been thinking Aura. And we need confirmation before we go ashore, he said. Mira's contact. Is there word yet? As though summoned by the question, which Jon suspected was not entirely coincidence, that Mira had a quality of appearing precisely when relevant information was being discussed. The small Lysini woman materialized at Cass's elbow from the direction of the ship's lower deck. She had a folded piece of paper in her hand, which she held out to Jon with the expression of someone delivering a document they have already read and processed and formed opinions about. Jon took it and unfolded it. It was written in a hand he didn't recognize, in a cipher that Mira had already partially decoded in the margins. Her annotations in tiny, precise script, threading between the lines of the original message like a second conversation happening simultaneously. Jon read it once, then again, his jaw tightening on the second pass. The gray wolf breathes, the lion sharpens. A fortnight, perhaps less. The young king grows impatient with delay, and his mother grows impatient with his impatience. The Septon Council's mercy for political advantage. The small council is divided. The hand will be asked to confess publicly, trading a head for a sentence of the wall. He will refuse or he will not. Either outcome serves the lion. Jon lowered the paper. His father was alive. His father had perhaps a fortnight. His father was being offered the wall, the Night's Watch, as an alternative to execution, which meant Cersei Lannister was calculating that a living Ned Stark on the wall was more useful to her than a dead one in the ground, because a dead one made a martyr, and living men on the wall were simply gone. She wants him to take the black, Jon said. It appears so, Mira said, which gives us a window. If he accepts, they move him north under escort, a different problem entirely. If he refuses, he'll refuse, Jon said with absolute certainty. Mira studied him. You're sure? Ned Stark does not take a vow he doesn't intend to keep, Jon said. On him, and he wouldn't take the black as a political bargain. He'd consider it. He'd consider it because of my sisters, because of the leverage Cersei has over them. But he wouldn't do it. He'd see through what it was. He paused. Which means when he refuses, the timeline compresses. Then we don't wait for the harbor approach, Cass said immediately, his planner's mind already restructuring. We can't use the main Blackwater harbor. Lannister patrols since the war began are running double on commercial traffic. We go north of the city, the fishermen's landing at the Mudgate approach. It's less monitored. The Gold Cloaks focus their harbor attention south. How long from that landing to Flea Bottom? Jon asked. On foot, moving carefully at night. 2 hours, Cass said. Maybe less if the streets are cooperative. They won't be, Aura said from somewhere behind Jon. He turned. She had been on deck longer than he'd realized, sitting with her back against the mast in the morning light, with a blade across her knees, listening with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything. Total and invisible simultaneously. King's Landing is not cooperative at the best of times. During a succession crisis with a child king and a nervous queen regent, it will be actively hostile to anything that looks out of place. We look like merchants, Mira said. We look like the kind of small trading party that comes through the Mudgate approach twice a week. I have papers for 7 of us. The rest? She looked at the pack members visible on deck, at Darrow specifically, in whose physical dimensions made the word merchant function as a significant creative exercise. We'll need to stay with the boat until we need them for the Flea Bottom stage. Darrow stays with the boat, Aldrich said. He had been sitting on a coil of rope at the prow for the duration of the conversation, far enough away that Jon had assumed he wasn't part of it. He was always part of it. Takes 2 others. The rest of us go ashore in the merchant configuration, and we split at the Mudgate. Mira takes the commercial entry with 3. Cass manages perimeter at the Street of Steel end. Jon and Aura move to the flea bottom access point. He stood and crossed the deck with the ship's movement in a way that suggested he had spent considerable time on water. And Jon looked at him. When we get there, Aldrich said, and we get to your father, what happens if he won't come? The question landed with the weight of something Cass had been too professional to ask, and Aura had been too perceptive to ask, and Mira had been too precise to ask. Aldrich asked it because he was the kind of leader who asked the questions that needed asking regardless of whether asking them was comfortable. Jon had been avoiding the shape of this question for the entire crossing, not the possibility. He had known the possibility existed, had known it in the specific way you knew things about people who had raised you and whose character you understood at a level that bypassed argument. Ned Stark was not a man who prioritized his own survival above what he considered right. He had gone to King's Landing knowing the risk. He had stayed knowing the risk had materialized. And the question of whether he would choose escape over whatever obligation he had constructed around his daughters, around his confession, around the particular mathematics of honor that governed his every decision, it was not an abstract question. Then I carry him out, Jon said. Aldrich held his gaze for a moment. Men don't carry well when they don't want to be carried, he said, particularly stubborn northern lords. I know, Jon said, and if carrying him puts the pack at risk? This was the real question. This was the question beneath the question. Not what Jon would do for his father, but what he would ask of men who owed his father nothing. Men who were risking their lives for a sword and a story, and whatever Aldrich Grey had seen in a bastard's eyes and a ruined olive press. Jon looked around the deck at the wolf pack, at Cass with his planner's maps and managed pain, at Mira with her languages and her forgeries and her quality of invisibility, at Aura with her blades and her assessment, at Edwin with his broken nose and his recalibrated opinion, at the others whose competencies he had been cataloging and whose trust he had not yet fully earned and might not earn before they walked into the most dangerous city in Westeros together. If carrying him puts anyone at risk, Jon said carefully, I'll make the call, and I'll live with it. Aldrich nodded once, the nod of a man who had received an answer that was honest rather than comfortable, and who valued the distinction. The salted crow pushed westward through the narrow sea's complicated gray. Schwerin King's Landing grew closer with every hour in the way that necessary and terrible things grew closer. Not rushing toward you, but simply reducing, incrementally, the distance between where you were and where you were going to have to be. That night Jon lay on the ship's deck under the autumn stars and thought about his father in the dark below the Red Keep, and about Ghost at the wall's gate with red eyes full of something that translated too slowly, and about the sound the wall made, that ancient pressurized quiet that was not silence, and whether he would ever stand beneath it again. He thought, I am becoming something Westeros didn't make me. He thought, I don't know yet if that's survival or loss. The stars gave no answer. They never did, in any world where men looked up at them and asked. King's Landing smelled like ambition and rot in proportions that shifted depending on which direction the wind came from. From the sea it smelled primarily of fish and bilge, and the particular salt iron tang of a harbor that processed more commerce than it was originally designed for. From the north it smelled of the city itself, cook-fire smoke and tannery, and the sweet, sick undertone of too many people living in too little space with insufficient drainage. From the south on the right day, it smelled of wildfire. Not burning wildfire. The Alchemists Guild kept their stores sealed in the vaults beneath the city. But the ghost of it, the chemical memory embedded in the stones of a city that had nearly burned to its foundations more than once, and carried the knowledge of that possibility the way a man carried an old scar. Jon smelled all of it as the salted crow dropped anchor north of the Mudgate approach in the gray hour before the city's morning bells. He had been awake since before dawn, sitting at the prow with Longclaw across his knees, watching King's Landing resolve from a dark mass on the western horizon into the thing it actually was, vast and sprawling and indifferent, climbing its hill toward the Red Keep's towers with the chaotic ambition of a city that had grown faster than any plan could contain. He had never been here. Robb had never been here. Their father had come here and not come back. Mira appeared beside him with the merchant papers she had spent the previous evening finalizing. 7 documents in varying states of authentic-looking wear, each identifying the party as a Bravosi Spice Consortium's advance team investigating supply routes for the upcoming winter trading season. The papers were exceptionally good. Jon had examined them twice and found nothing that would fail a cursory inspection by a moderately attentive gold cloak. "The contact on the Street of Steel," Jon said quietly. "He'll know the current rotation schedule for the Black Cells?" "He'll know what a merchant who supplies the Red Keep's kitchens can know," Mira said, which was her precise way of saying yes, but within limits. "Guard rotations change. What we'll have is the standard pattern with any known deviations from the past week. It won't be perfect." "Nothing about this is perfect," Jon said. "No," Mira agreed. "But imperfect information acted on decisively is better than perfect information arrived at too late. That's Cass's line. He uses it constantly. It becomes less irritating when you discover it's consistently true." They went ashore in 2 groups. Mira led the merchant party through the mud gates' morning traffic. A genuine river of commerce flowing into the city as the gates opened, carts and livestock and walking traders, and the general organized chaos of a major city's daily intake. The gold cloaks at the gate were doing what gold cloaks always did, selectively applying scrutiny based on an economic logic that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with the informal tax of inconvenience applied to those who couldn't afford to move past it quickly. Mira moved her group through with the papers and 3 silver coins distributed with the practiced invisibility of someone who had paid bribes on 4 continents and understood that the transaction was smoother when no one had to acknowledge it was happening. Jon and Aura came through separately 10 minutes later as laborers, rough clothes borrowed from the salted crow screw, hoods against the autumn morning chill, Jon's Valyrian steel wrapped in oilcloth inside a tools pack that he carried on his back with the particular practiced discomfort of a man used to carrying things he couldn't afford to set down. Aura had done something to her posture and her face that Jon could not entirely account for. She was still entirely herself, but somehow less visible, yet as though she had adjusted some quality of her presence that made the eye slide past her without registering. They moved into Flea Bottom without incident. Flea Bottom was the city's lowest district in every sense. Lowest on the hill, lowest in wealth, lowest in the quality of attention the city's governing structure paid to it. The streets were narrow enough in places that 2 people walking abreast required negotiation, and the buildings on either side leaned toward each other at the upper stories with the familiarity of old neighbors who had long since surrendered the concept of personal space. The smell was considerable. The activity was constant. Flea Bottom never fully slept and never fully woke, maintaining instead a permanent state of exhausted hustle that was its own kind of vitality. Jon followed Aura through its warrens with his hood up and his eyes down, and his entire attention on remembering Cass's route description while simultaneously reading the street for anything that required immediate response. He had learned this dual awareness at Castle Black, the ranger's skill of processing environment at multiple levels simultaneously, the near and the far, the immediate and the contingent. Flea Bottom rewarded it. The district had its own social geography, its own territorial logic, and moving through it as an obvious outsider required the specific combination of confidence and invisibility that said, "I belong here," without saying I'm important enough to challenge. They reached the access point 40 minutes after entering the city. It was exactly where Cass's map had placed it. A drainage channel entrance behind a tanner's workshop on a narrow lane that connected the Street of Flower to a smaller alley with no name that Jon knew of. The entrance was sealed with an iron grate that had last been maintained during a rain Jon couldn't immediately identify from the rust patterns. Aura examined it for 30 seconds, produced a tool from somewhere on her person, and had it open in the time it took Jon to check the lane in both directions twice. "Cass surveyed this 3 years ago," Jon said quietly, looking into the darkness below. "Cass is thorough," Aura said, "and drainage doesn't change. Or now it's one of the few things in this world that stays where you put it." She dropped into the opening with the controlled ease of someone entirely comfortable with confined dark spaces. Jon followed. The passage was low enough that he had to move in a crouch, which after the first 10 minutes produced a specific complaint from his lower back that he filed under acceptable operational discomfort and ignored. The darkness was nearly complete. Aura had a small oil lamp, shielded to produce the minimum light necessary for navigation, which turned the passage into a corridor of close orange warmth and profound shadow. The smell was everything expected and worse. The sound was the city filtered through stone, muffled, rhythmic, the pulse of King's Landing translated into subsonic pressure. They moved in silence for 20 minutes. Jon was counting paces against Cass's distance estimates when Aura stopped and held up a closed fist. Jon stopped. They stood in the passage's compressed quiet and listened. Footsteps. Above them, moving along what Cass's map identified as the storage corridor adjacent to the outer black cell wall. One set, moving with the deliberate regularity of a patrol, rather than the purposeful irregularity of someone responding to something. They waited. The footsteps completed their circuit and receded. Aura moved forward. The access point that connected the drainage passage to the storage corridor was a maintenance hatch. Iron, old, set into the passage ceiling, at a point where the drainage system had been built to allow inspection access from above. It was, Cass had noted in his survey, in the kind of infrastructure detail that existed in every large building and was known by the people who maintained it and forgotten by everyone else. The Red Keep's current maintenance staff apparently fell in the everyone else category because the hatch was undisturbed, its edges thick with the particular undisturbed grime of long neglect. Aura pushed it open by increments, a process that required patience that Jon discovered he possessed in considerably smaller quantities than he would have preferred. Each fraction of an inch risked sound. Aura managed it in silence. They came up into the storage corridor. It was exactly as Cass had described. Barrels and old timber, and the accumulated domestic debris of a fortress that had been continuously occupied for 300 years and had never developed a systematic approach to disposal. The torchlight here was minimal. 2 wall sconces at either end of the corridor, leaving the middle in deep shadow that Jon and Aura moved into immediately and held. 40 feet to the outer black cell wall, a heavy door, iron-banded oak, with a lock that Aura studied for 4 seconds before reaching for her tools. Then Jon heard something that stopped him entirely. Footsteps again. But not the patrol's regular rhythm. These were different. 2 sets moving together, coming from the direction of the stairwell that connected this level to the cells above. Moving with the specific, purposeful quality of people going somewhere rather than patrolling. Jon and Aura pressed back into the shadow of a barrel stack as 2 figures came down the stairwell and into the corridor. One was a gold-cloaked sergeant, torch in hand, is with the look of a man performing a task he found distasteful. The other was small, slight, bald, wearing robes that in the torchlight resolved into the particular shade of purple, favored by a man whose reputation Jon had heard described in ravens and rumors and his father's careful, measured assessments since childhood. Varys, the Spider, master of whisperers to the Iron Throne. He was walking through the storage corridor adjacent to the black cells at an hour when no member of the small council had any legitimate reason to be there, moving with the unhurried confidence of a man who went where he chose and had long since made the necessary arrangements with the people who might otherwise object. He stopped, not because he had seen them. Jon was certain he had not seen them. The shadow was deep and their stillness was complete. He stopped because he appeared to be thinking, his smooth face tilted slightly upward in the manner of someone resolving an internal calculation. Then without turning, without changing his posture, in a voice pitched precisely low enough to carry 2 feet and no further, Varys said, "The bastard of Winterfell is more resourceful than his father, it seems." Lord Stark walked into King's Landing through the front gate. His son came through the sewers. There is, perhaps, a lesson in that, though I suspect this is not the moment for philosophy. Jon's hand was on Longclaw's hilt. Aura had gone absolutely still in the way she went still when she was deciding between 3 options simultaneously and had not yet selected one. Varys turned then, slowly, in and faced the barrel stack's shadow with the expression of a man who found the universe consistently interesting. "I have been expecting someone to make this attempt," he said quietly. I confess I did not anticipate the Essosi configuration. The wolf pack's reputation is considerable in certain circles. A pause. I have information you require. Your father is alive, he has refused the confession twice, and Joffrey will not wait past the new moon. You have 4 days. Another pause, shorter. I also have information you do not yet know you require, which is considerably more valuable. Whether I share it depends entirely on this conversation's next 30 seconds. The gold-cloaked sergeant was staring at the barrel stack with the dawning expression of a man realizing the Master of Whisperers had been talking to something in the shadows, which meant the Master of Whisperers knew something was in the shadows, which meant the appropriate professional response was probably to pretend very hard that he had heard and seen nothing at all. Jon stepped out of the shadow. Varys looked at him with the particular quality of attention that suggested he was seeing several things simultaneously. Jon's age, his bearing, the Valyrian steel on his back, the sewer grime on his borrowed laborer's clothes, the expression on his face that was his father's stubbornness wearing his mother's features. Though Varys would be one of the very few people in the world who might recognize both sources. 4 days, Jon said. 4 days, Varys confirmed. And we have, I think, only considerably less than 4 days worth of time to spend in this corridor before someone notices the spider conversing with the shadows. His hands folded together in his sleeves, with the gesture Jon had heard described as his habitual posture of patient attention. Shall we speak somewhere marginally less architecturally compromising? Jon looked at Aura. Aura looked at Jon with the expression of someone who had planned for many contingencies and had not planned for this one, and was rapidly determining whether that was a problem or an opportunity. 4 days. His father was alive and immovable, and had 4 days. Lead, Jon said to Varys. The Master of Whisperers smiled with the gentle satisfaction of a man whose pieces had arrived precisely where the board required them. Eden Varys moved through the Red Keep's underbelly with the comfort of a man walking his own home, which Jon understood within the first 5 minutes of following him was precisely what it was. The passages he used were not the servants' corridors or the maintenance routes that any determined explorer might discover. They were something older, something that existed in the gap between the castle's official architecture and its actual structure. Narrow spaces behind walls, passages that ran beneath floors, connections between parts of the keep that had no logical reason to be connected, except that someone had wanted them connected and had the resources and discretion to make it happen without record. Varys moved through these spaces without a torch. He had clearly navigated them so many times that darkness was simply the medium, not an obstacle. Jon and Aura followed by sound and by the faint residual warmth of a body moving ahead of them. And Jon thought about the years of patient construction this represented. Not just the physical passages, but the knowledge of them, the cultivation of every servant and steward and goldcloak, who either knew about them or needed not to know. The entire invisible infrastructure of a man whose power derived entirely from knowing things other people didn't. They emerged into a small chamber that Jon could not have placed within the keep's geography. A room perhaps 12 feet square, furnished with 2 chairs, a small table with a covered lamp, and shelves of scrolls that had the organized density of documents consulted regularly rather than stored and forgotten. The lamp, when Varys uncovered it, produced a warm, steady light that made the chamber feel less like a hiding place and more like a study that had chosen unusual architecture. The gold-cloaked sergeant had not followed them. Jon suspected the man was already constructing a very thorough account of having seen absolutely nothing. Varys settled into one of the chairs with the ease of long habit and looked at Jon with the expression that Jon was beginning to identify as his default register. The expression of a man who was paying close attention and was very practiced at not showing how close. Sit, Varys said. What I have to tell you is not improved by being told to someone standing at combat readiness. Jon did not sit. Aura remained near the entrance, not blocking it but positioned relative to it in a way that preserved options. You said 4 days, Jon said. Just tell me what happens on the 5th. Joffrey has been persuaded twice to delay, Varys said. Once by his mother, who understands that a public execution of the former hand creates a martyr the North will rally behind for a generation. Once by the High Septon, who argued that mercy toward a confessed traitor demonstrates the crown's divine legitimacy more effectively than severity. A pause. Your father has not confessed. He has been offered the wall repeatedly and refused repeatedly, with the particular polite immovability that I understand is characteristic of the Stark family in all its branches. A glance at Jon that contained briefly something that might have been dry appreciation. On the fifth day, Joffrey's patience, such as it is, will be formally exhausted. Cersei will stop trying to manage him. Sir Island Payne will be given his instruction. Then we go in on the third day, Jon said. The night before the new moon. Maximum darkness for the street work, and enough buffer that we're not moving on the same day the crown is on highest alert. A reasonable operational assessment, Varys said, though I would suggest the second night rather than the third, because there is a variable you are not accounting for. He folded his hands. Lord Slint. Jon knew the name. Janos Slint, commander of the City Watch. Ned's reports had described him as a corrupt instrument of Lannister money, a man who had sold his loyalty to the highest bidder with the cheerful transparency of someone who saw no reason to pretend otherwise. It had been Janos Slint's gold cloaks who had arrested Ned. P. Slint has been informed that an attempt may be made, Varys said. Not by me. I have been in this matter conspicuously uninformed in all official capacities. By Cersei's own intelligence, which is less comprehensive than mine but not negligible. She has added a secondary guard rotation to the black cells beginning in 3 days' time. Double the men, staggered hours, no predictable pattern. Jon felt the information land and recalculate against everything Cass had planned on the Salted Crow's deck. The secondary rotation changed the corridor timing, changed the window at the access point, changed the margins on everything from the flea bottom entry to the extraction route. You're telling me this, Jon said. Why? It was the question that mattered. Everything Varys had offered. The timeline, the rotation change. I know the warning was information that served Jon's purpose. Nothing in Jon's experience of how power functioned in Westeros suggested that powerful men offered useful information without a mechanism of return that made the gift more expensive than it appeared. Varys looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of consideration that preceded honesty rather than preceded performance. I serve the realm, Varys said. I am aware of how that sounds, spoken in a hidden room by a eunuch who has served 3 kings of varying sanity and capability. I am aware that every man who has ever said those words has been suspected of using them as cover for personal ambition. I cannot resolve that suspicion for you, and I will not try. What I can tell you is that Ned Stark is one of perhaps 4 people currently alive in the 7 kingdoms whose continued existence serves the realm's long-term stability more than his death does. A pause. The North does not forget. A Stark on the wall is a symbol of Lannister power's reach. A Stark in his grave is a generation of Northern war. A Stark alive and free in the North, where his authority is genuine, is a counterbalance to a child king and a regent who is already making decisions that will cost this kingdom more than she understands. And Jon Snow specifically, Jon said, what does Jon Snow serve? Varys's expression shifted, slightly, precisely. That, he said, is a question whose answer is considerably longer than our current time permits. What I will say is that bastards who cross the narrow sea and hire wolves and crawl through the Red Keep sewers for love of their fathers are the kind of people whose futures I prefer to remain open rather than closed. He paused. There are those who would say that sentiment is sentimental. I would say it is strategic. The difference is smaller than most philosophers admit. Jon held Varys's gaze for a moment and made a calculation that was less about trust. He did not trust Varys, and suspected that Varys would have been disappointed if he had, and more about utility. The information was consistent. The rotation change, the timeline compression, the detail about Slint. These were things that served Jon's mission, regardless of Varys's motivation for providing them. And acting on them was correct, whether the gift was genuine charity or elaborate manipulation. What else? Jon said. Varys smiled, small, careful. Your father's cell is the third from the eastern end of the lower block. He has a candle. He is, and I note this because I imagine it is relevant to your planning, in better physical condition than men typically are after weeks in the black cells, because a certain person has ensured that his food has been adequate and his candle replaced when it burns low. A brief pause that contained, Jon suspected, more than it appeared to. He has also, I am told, been speaking quietly to himself in the darkness. The words are not entirely coherent to the guard who reported them. They appear to be something between prayer and inventory, as though he is cataloging everything he values before the possibility of losing it. Something moved in Jon's chest that was not tactically relevant and was also entirely unavoidable. He doesn't know anyone is coming, Jon said. No, Varys said gently. He doesn't know anyone is coming. Jon stood in the lamplight of Varys's impossible room and let himself feel that for exactly the duration of a single breath. Then he put it away. The second night, he said, we need to reorganize the timing. I thought you might, Varys said. He reached into his sleeve and produced a folded document. Another map. But this one was of a quality that made Cass's careful hand drawings look like a child's approximation. Every passage in the lower keep, the guard positions marked with notations, one the drainage system rendered with architectural precision, the storage corridor and the black cell block, and the secondary access points that Cass had not known about, because they could only be known about if someone had been maintaining them for years. Jon took the map and unfolded it and looked at it for a long moment. There was a second access point, closer to the cells than the flea bottom hatch by 20 feet. Positioned behind the eastern wall of the storage corridor, which meant the 40-foot open stretch became 20 feet, which changed the patrol window from dangerously tight to functionally manageable. This passage, Jon said, pointing, has been kept clear, Varys said, for contingencies. This is one. Jon looked up from the map. If we're caught, you will not have been here, Varys said. I will have been engaged in a late evening conversation with the Grand Master about the theoretical properties of certain Eastern herbs, which is a conversation that will be entirely documented and entirely boring. He paused. I find it useful to be boring in the right places. Jon refolded the map and put it inside his laborer's coat. He looked at Aura, who had been processing the entire conversation with her characteristic stillness, and whose expression now contained the specific quality of recalculation. Not doubt, but the focused adjustment of a professional integrating new information into existing plans. We need to get back to Cass, Aura said. Tonight. The timing change alone requires at least half a day to rebuild the street plan. The flea bottom access point, Jon said to Varys. Can it be used for the distraction team's entry without compromising the cell approach? If your distraction is staged in the upper flea bottom, rather than the lower, further from the drainage entrance, then the Gold Cloak's response will draw west rather than east, leaving the Mudgate corridor clear for your extraction. Varys tilted his head. You have thought carefully about this. I've had help, Jon said. He paused at the chamber's entrance, where Aura was already oriented back toward the passages that would return them to the drainage system. He looked at Varys across the lamplight, at the smooth, composed face of the most dangerous man in King's Landing, sitting in his impossible room surrounded by his scrolls, serving his inscrutable realm through methods that made every honest man uncomfortable. Why are my sisters still at court? Jon said. It was not quite a question. Varys's expression did not change, but something behind it did. A brief movement of something that might, in a less carefully controlled person, have been compassion. Because they are leverage, Varys said, and because so long as they remain leverage, they remain necessary, and necessary things are kept alive. A pause. Sansa is adapting after a fashion that will either destroy her or make her formidable. It is, I confess, not yet clear which. Another pause. Arya has not been found. Jon went very still. Arya, he said, slipped her escort the day of Lord Stark's arrest, Varys said. She is somewhere in this city. My little birds have caught glimpses. A girl with a sword who moves like someone taught her to move, which narrows it considerably. I have not reported this to the crown. His hands settled in their habitual fold. Some information is more valuable kept than shared. Jon stood in the doorway of the impossible room and understood that King's Landing was considerably more complicated than a rescue plan could fully account for, and that Varys had just added a variable that changed the emotional geometry of everything. Not the operational plan, not the tactical approach, but the human calculus beneath it. His father in a cell. His sister somewhere in the city's vast, dangerous dark. His other sister, a hostage in a court that was keeping her alive only so long as she was useful. He thought about Aldrich's question on the ship. What happens if he won't come? He thought about a different version of that question now. A harder one. What do you leave behind when you can only carry one thing? I'll find her, Jon said. He did not know if he was saying it to Varys or to himself. I know, Varys said, with the tone of a man who knew a great many things and had learned that knowing them was rarely as useful as people hoped. Jon and Aura went back into the dark. Cass received the revised intelligence with the focused stillness of a man whose relationship with bad news had matured past emotional response into pure operational processing. He spread Varys's map beside his own on the floor of the room Mira had secured. A chandler's storage room above a shop on the Street of Steel, rented through a chain of intermediaries that left no direct connection to anyone currently breathing, to smelling powerfully of tallow and rendered fat, and the particular waxy warmth of 1,000 candles in various stages of manufacture. The pack had assembled in the room's limited space with the practiced compression of people accustomed to planning in whatever architecture was available. Jon walked them through everything, the timeline compression, the secondary rotation beginning in 3 days. Jon Slint's awareness of a potential attempt, the second access point, Arya. He told them about Arya last, and he told them plainly, without framing it as an operational consideration or a tactical variable, because it was neither of those things, and the Wolfpack had demonstrated sufficient intelligence to recognize dishonesty about motivation when they encountered it. My sister is somewhere in this city, he said. She's 9 years old, and she's been alone since the day my father was arrested. Finding her is not part of the plan we agreed on. It is also not something I can agree not to do. The room was quiet for a moment. How? Aldrich said. Not whether. How? Jon filed that away with the particular gratitude of a man who had learned not to expect it and was therefore more affected by it than he would have been otherwise. Varys said his informants had glimpsed her, Jon said. A girl with a sword, moving like someone trained. She had a dancing master, Syrio Forel, a Bravosi water dancer. He'd have taught her to move in specific ways. He paused. She won't be hiding. Arya doesn't hide. She watches. She'd be somewhere with sight lines. Somewhere she can see without being seen. Flea Bottom, Mira said immediately. Everyone looked at her. It's where a child alone goes in this city who has enough intelligence to avoid the obvious places. The Watch doesn't maintain real presence there. Too dense, too hostile to official authority. And a child who moves well and stays quiet can survive indefinitely in Flea Bottom's upper warrens. She paused. I spent 2 months in Flea Bottom once. It has an internal community structure that protects children who learn its rules quickly. Arya would learn its rules in a day, Jon said with the absolute certainty of a brother. Then we look in Flea Bottom, Aldrich said. He looked at Jon with the measuring directness that Jon had come to recognize as his form of honesty. But Jon, we look while we plan, not instead of planning. Your sister being alive somewhere in this city does not change the primary objective. Your father has 4 days. E3 now since we lose tonight to reorganization. The sister search runs parallel or it doesn't run. Parallel, Jon said. I understand. Cass had been studying Varys's map throughout this exchange with the focused intensity of a man who had found something that interested him professionally. He looked up now with the expression of a planner who has identified an elegance that the original architects of a situation had not intended. The second access point changes the entire eastern approach, he said. He pointed at the map with his blunt finger. This passage, here, running behind the eastern storage wall, it connects to the drainage system at a point that's accessible from inside Flea Bottom's lower warrens. Not from the lane behind the tanners, from inside the warren structure itself. He looked up. Jory, which means if your sister is in Flea Bottom's upper levels and we establish contact with her, she could potentially lead us to the lower warren access point directly. She'd know that territory better than any of us could in the time we have. The room was quiet again, but differently. The quality of quiet that followed an unexpected alignment of separate problems into a single solution. A 9-year-old girl as our guide into the Red Keep's drainage system, Aura said, with the tone of someone testing how that sentence sounded aloud. A 9-year-old girl trained by a Bravosi water dancer who has been surviving alone in Flea Bottom for weeks, Mira corrected. That is a materially different thing. It is, Aldrich said slowly. He looked at Jon. If we find her, if she's willing, if she knows the territory well enough to be useful and not a liability. He held up a hand before Jon could speak. I'm not saying no. I'm saying the conditions matter. I know, Jon said, and I know Arya. He paused, thinking about his sister, about the girl who had sat across from him at Winterfell's table with her hair in her eyes and her dire wolf Nymeria at her feet, and a look of fierce, impatient intelligence that had always reminded Jon more of himself than any of his true-born siblings. Perhaps because they had both spent their lives navigating spaces that hadn't been fully designed for them. She'll want to come in. Keeping her out will be the problem, not convincing her. Then we find her first, Aldrich said. He looked around the room at the pack, at the faces assembled in the Chandler's tallow warmth, and the map on the floor between them, the city outside the shuttered window making its constant noise. Mira and Edwin take the Flea Bottom search, starting at first light. Move through the upper warrens, make contact with the internal community structure, find out if a girl matching the description has been seen, where she's been sleeping, what her pattern is. Jon goes with them. Jon opened his mouth. Jon goes with them, Aldrich repeated, with the tone that had ended arguments before they developed. Because if she sees him, she comes. If she sees Mira and Edwin first, she runs. Your face is the only thing in this city she'll recognize as safety. Jon closed his mouth. Aldrich was right. He usually was about the things that mattered tactically, which was, Jon was coming to understand, why the wolf pack was still alive and operational after what appeared to be a significant number of years, doing things that should statistically have gotten them all killed. The rest of us rebuild the street plan, Aldrich continued. Cass runs the timing. Aura and I walk the extraction route above ground, the path from the Mudgate corridor to the harbor approach, and identify every point where the gold cloaks could interdict. Darrow maintains the boat and has it ready to move at the second night's second bell, not the third. We lose 1 day of preparation, but we gain 1 day of buffer against Slint's secondary rotation. He paused. Any objections? There were no objections. The Wolfpack did not operate by committee in the way that Westerosi councils did. By the formal expression of objections and their formal overruling, and the elaborate ritual of disagreement that produced the same outcome as simple authority, but required considerably more time and generated considerably more resentment. What the pack had instead was a culture of expressed concerns before decisions and committed execution after them. The concerns had been expressed. The decision was made. They moved at first light. Flea Bottom in the early morning had a quality that its nighttime version entirely lacked, a kind of exhausted, provisional hopefulness that came with the return of light to spaces that spent most of their existence in shadow. The cook fires started early here. The smell of cheap food being prepared was the district's morning announcement, mixing with the cold autumn air and the persistent undertones of the city's less appetizing realities. Its children moved through the alleys on errands that had the purposeful quality of children who had learned to be useful or go hungry. Jon moved through it with Mira on one side and Edwin on the other, trying to look like a laborer accompanying two merchants on a supply run, which was exactly what he was trying to look like, and exactly what no one in Flea Bottom, whose collective ability to read people had been honed by generations of survival, entirely believed. Mira handled the community navigation with the skill of someone who had done this before, in places where the stakes were comparable. She did not ask about a specific child. Asking about a specific child in a district that survived by protecting its own against outside attention was the kind of move that closed doors and opened mouths to authorities. Instead, she bought food from 3 different cook stall operators, paid slightly more than asked, and conducted what appeared to be casual conversation about the winter provision situation, while actually constructing a picture of the district's recent social geography from the information volunteered in return. By the second hour, she had an area. By the third, she had a building, a disused granary in the Upper Warren's northeastern corner, 3 stories, accessible from the roof via a route that ran through 2 adjacent buildings, and required the kind of agile navigation that significantly limited the population of people who could use it. John looked at the granary from the alley opposite with the particular quality of held breath that preceded things you had been building toward. "I'll go up alone," he said. "John," Edwin started. "She'll bolt if she sees strangers," John said. "Give me a count of 200. If I'm not back down or signaling by then, come up." He didn't wait for agreement. He crossed the alley and found the route, the adjacent building's side entrance, the interior stairwell to the second floor, the window that connected to the neighboring structure's roof, the gap between buildings that required a running step he was glad he'd taken before fully thinking about it, and came up onto the granary's roof in the gray morning light, with the city spread below him in all its complicated, indifferent immensity. She was there. She was sitting at the granary roof's eastern parapet, with her back against the stonework and her knees drawn up in needle. The small sword John had given her, had commissioned for her. Man, the sword that was the physical record of his understanding of who she was, across her lap. She was watching the Red Keep's towers over the roofline of the city between them, watching with the focused, patient attention of someone who had been watching for a long time and had not yet decided what watching was going to become. She looked thinner. She looked older in a way that had nothing to do with time passing. Her hair was a disaster, and her clothes were wrong for the season, and she had a cut along her jawline that had healed badly in the manner of cuts that don't receive proper attention. She heard him before she saw him. She was off the parapet and on her feet with needle raised in a single motion that was pure Serio Forel. Economical, balanced, committed, before she had consciously processed who she was pointing it at. Then she saw his face. The expression that crossed her face in the moment of recognition was something John knew he would carry for the rest of his life, regardless of how long or short that turned out to be. It was not the simple relief of a child finding safety. It was more complicated than that. It was the expression of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could put it down, except they were not entirely sure yet whether putting it down was safe, whether this was real, whether the thing they were seeing was what it appeared to be, or another version of a world that had repeatedly shown them that appearances were specifically designed to deceive. "John," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected and younger than he expected simultaneously. "Arya," he said. She crossed the roof in 4 steps and hit him with the full weight of a 9-year-old who had been alone in Flea Bottom for weeks and had not permitted herself to be anything other than Serio Forel's student and a girl with a sword and a list of names. And John caught her and held on with both arms and said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and everything necessary was already being communicated through the simple fact of being here, of having come. After a moment, she pulled back and looked at him with wet eyes that she was absolutely not going to acknowledge. "You left the wall," she said. "Yes," he said. For father." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment with the assessing intelligence that had always been the core of her. The thing underneath the wildness and the stubbornness and the refusal to be what Winterfell's expectations required, the sheer perceptive acuity of a person who saw things as they were, rather than as she'd been told they were. "You have a plan," she said. "Yes," he said. "Tell me," she said. Not "can I help" or "take me with you" or any of the formulations that required his permission. Simply "tell me," as though the plan was already hers and the telling was a courtesy. John looked at his sister on the granary roof, with the city spread below them, and the Red Keep's towers visible over the roofline between here and everything that needed to happen next, and he told her. Arya knew the Lower Warren's northeastern passage better than Cass's map knew it. This was not a surprise to John. It was precisely the kind of thing Arya did with environments that other people used and she inhabited, the difference between living somewhere and passing through it. But it was a surprise to Cass, who spent 40 minutes with her in the Chandler's storage room that evening, going over the granary roof's route to the Lower Warren access point, and came away from the conversation with the expression of a man whose professional pride had been simultaneously challenged and satisfied. "She's corrected 3 of my distance estimates," he told Jon quietly afterward, with a tone that contained more respect than complaint. "And she knows a secondary collapse in the Eastern Passage that would have put you and Aura on your faces in a drainage channel 3 hours into the approach." "Is it workable?" Jon asked. "It's workable," Cass said. "Different from what we planned. Better, actually. The route she's mapped bypasses the open section in the storage corridor entirely. You come up through the eastern wall directly. The 40 feet becomes 8. Jon absorbed this. 8 feet of open ground instead of 40 was not an incremental improvement. It was the difference between a manageable risk and a manageable risk with comfortable margins. "She goes in with us," Jon said. Cass did not argue. He had the planner's unsentimental recognition of what the revised numbers meant. And what they meant was that a 9-year-old girl who had spent weeks mapping Flea Bottom's understructure while surviving alone in a city at war with itself was operationally essential to the success of a rescue that 7 adults with significant combined experience had been struggling to make work cleanly. Arya received the news that she would be part of the approach with the specific quality of restraint that Jon recognized as her version of not showing how much she wanted something. She nodded once, checked Needle's edge with her thumb in the manner of someone who had learned to make that gesture automatic, and asked Cass 3 operational questions in succession that made the planner blink and answer them seriously. Aldrich observed this from across the room and said nothing. Later, when Jon found him alone checking the extraction route documentation, Aldrich said, "Your sister's going to be either very important or very dead before she's grown. Possibly both, in that order." "She's Arya," Jon said, as though that explained everything. "Yes," Aldrich said, "I can see that." The second night arrived with the particular quality of autumn darkness that King's Landing produced. Not the clean, cold dark of the north, but a layered dark, street torch light, filtering through smoke and river mist. The city's noise reduced but not silenced. A low amber glow against the clouds from the fires and lamps of 300,000 people going about the compressed nocturnal business of a city that never entirely stopped. They moved at the second bell. The distraction went first. Darrow and 2 others, a quiet Lysini man named Pero and Edwin, had spent the afternoon moving through Flea Bottom's upper market, establishing the components of a fire that would read as accidental, because accidental fires in Flea Bottom were common enough that the Gold Cloak's response was practiced and reflexive and drew men from a wide radius without requiring them to think about it. The fire was small, controlled, set in a location that endangered no one while producing enough smoke and noise, and the specific communal panic of fire in a crowded district to pull every Gold Cloak patrol in the lower city's western section toward it with the reliable momentum of trained response. Jon heard the alarm bells from the drainage passage entrance and felt the vibration of running feet through the stone above them. "Us moving," Aura said quietly. The approach team was 4: Jon, Aura, Arya, and Mira, who came not for combat but for the cell lock, which Cass had assessed as a different model than the storage corridor's maintenance hatches and which required a different set of tools and a different quality of patience. Arya led through the lower warren with a small hooded lamp held low, moving through the passage with the water dancer's economy of motion. No wasted steps, no hesitation at junctions. The kind of navigational confidence that came from having walked a route enough times that it existed in muscle memory rather than conscious recall. The collapsed section Cass had warned about was exactly where Arya had said it was, a section of drainage wall that had partially given way, and narrowing the passage to a crawl space that required them to move in single file on hands and knees through a stretch of approximately 15 feet, which produced in Jon the specific combination of claustrophobia and pragmatism that he was choosing to categorize simply as operational discomfort and address by not thinking about it. They came up through the eastern wall access exactly where Varys's map had promised, 8 feet of open ground. The storage corridor was torchlit at its far end only. The near section where they emerged was in the deep shadow that the architecture naturally produced between the wall's access point and the nearest sconce. Jon counted 3 seconds, heard nothing from the patrol direction, shot and crossed the 8 feet to the cell block door, in a controlled movement that was not quite running and not quite walking, and was specifically designed to produce the minimum possible sound on stone flooring. Mira was at the lock in 4 seconds. The lock took 90. Jon stood with his back to the door and watched the corridor in both directions and listened to King's Landing's muffled heartbeat through the stone and thought about nothing except the immediate geometry of what needed to happen next. The lock opened. The black cells were darker than the passage had been. A profound, specific darkness that was not incidental but architectural, designed by someone who understood that the absence of light was its own form of pressure. And the smell was stone and damp, and the particular staleness of air that had been breathed too many times in too confined a space. Jon produced a small candle from his coat, not enough to be seen from the corridor but enough to navigate by, and moved along the cell block with Arya at his shoulder and Aura behind, counting doors from the eastern end. 1, 2, 3. He stopped at the third door. He did not knock. Knocking felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate. Too formal. Too much like asking permission for something that was already decided. Instead, he said his father's name, quietly, in the specific register of a voice that carried through a cell door without carrying beyond it. "Father." Silence. Then from the other side of the door, the sound of movement. Careful, deliberate movement. The movement of a man who had learned to conserve himself in a confined space, and who was now orienting towards something unexpected. "Jon." Not a question, a statement of recognition that carried in it everything a father's voice could carry when it had been alone in the dark and had not expected to hear his son's voice through a cell door in the Red Keep's deepest level. "We're getting you out," Jon said. "Mira." Mira was already at the cell lock. This one was heavier than the block door. A different mechanism, a master locksmith's work rather than the standard issue of the storage corridor. She worked in silence with the focused attention of someone doing something difficult and doing it correctly regardless of how long correct took. Jon put his hand flat against the door. "Father, are you hurt?" "Bruised," Ned's voice came back, and with the quality of understatement that Jon recognized as his father's primary mode of self-assessment. "Nothing that won't mend." A pause. "How did you—" "Essos," Jon said. "I'll explain on the water. We have time for nothing here." Another pause. Longer. Weighted with something Jon could feel through the door. "Jon," Ned said. "Your sisters." "Arya's with me," Jon said. "She's here." A sharp intake of breath from the other side of the door. Then with a roughness in the voice that Ned Stark's control had clearly been working to prevent. "Arya." "I'm here, father," Arya said quietly. She was standing very still at Jon's shoulder, needle at her side, with the expression of someone who was holding themselves together through the application of considerable will and was not going to stop doing so until the situation permitted otherwise. Was the lock opened? Ned Stark was thinner than Jon had last seen him, which had been at Winterfell when Jon left for the Wall, which felt like a different world and a different life, and both of those things were true in ways Jon was not yet ready to fully examine. He was bearded in the manner of weeks without a razor, and the darkness had done what darkness did to men who were accustomed to open sky and northern wind. It had compressed something in his bearing that was not broken but was under pressure. He stood in the cell doorway, with the candle's light on his face, and looked at his bastard son and his youngest daughter, and the expression he wore was one that Jon filed carefully away in the part of himself that stored things too important for immediate processing. "Jon," he said, "you left the Wall." "Yes," Jon said. "Your vows—" "Father," Jon said with a gentleness that was also entirely firm, "we have perhaps 6 minutes before the patrol completes its extended circuit. We need to move." Ned looked at him for a moment, at the borrowed laborer's clothes, the oilcloth pack with Longclaw's shape visible inside it, the sewer grime that 3 hours in King's Landing's underbelly had deposited on everything Jon was wearing. He looked at Arya, who looked back with needle in her hand, and the cut on her jaw, and the expression of a girl who had been surviving alone in Flea Bottom, and was entirely prepared to survive further distances if necessary. Something in Ned's bearing recalibrated. Not the pressure releasing. That would take longer. would take open sky and distance and time, but the orientation shifting. They're from a man who had been measuring the dimensions of an ending to a man who was being asked to move toward a beginning. Sansa, he said, and there it was. Jon had known it was coming since Varys's impossible room. The question, beneath all the other questions. The variable that no operational plan could fully account for, because it was not operational. It was Ned Stark's specific moral mathematics. The calculation he ran constantly and could not be argued out of. She's in the keep, Jon said. Cersei is keeping her. She's alive and Varys believes she's being managed carefully, that she's leverage rather than a target. I won't leave her, Ned said, quietly without drama, with the absolute certainty of a man stating a fact about himself that he has known for a long time. Jon had expected this, for he had prepared for this. He had told Aldrich on the ship that he would carry his father out if necessary, and he had meant it. And he now looked at his father in the cell doorway and understood that carrying Ned Stark out against his will was not the same as carrying an unconscious man. It was carrying a man who would fight him, who would raise an alarm rather than be removed while his daughter remained, who would do this not out of stubbornness, but out of a genuine moral conviction so deep it had become structural, as fundamental to him as bone. Father, Jon said. He kept his voice steady. Sansa cannot be extracted tonight. She is in the keep's upper levels under direct Lannister watch. Getting to her from here would require moving through 3 guarded floors and past the Kingsguard. He paused. Going after her tonight means none of us leave. Then we go after her tonight and none of us leave, Ned said, with the specific, terrible calm of a man who has decided. Father, she is my daughter, Jon. And you are her father, Jon said. The only one she has. The only one any of us have. Dead, you are a symbol the North mourns and Cersei controls. Alive. He stopped himself because what came next was the argument he had been building since the Salted Crow's deck, and he needed it to land precisely, without the weight of desperation crushing its logic. Alive in the North, with the Stark name and the Stark authority, and the Stark bannermen who have not yet committed to Robb's war, you change what this is. You change what Sansa is to Cersei. Right now, she's the daughter of a dead traitor, which makes her worth less. Alive. You're the man Cersei failed to kill, which makes Sansa worth more. More worth keeping safe. More worth returning eventually when the politics demand it. Ned was quiet. Jon pressed forward because 6 minutes was becoming 5, and the corridor above them was not getting any more forgiving. Sansa survives by being valuable, Jon said. You make her more valuable by living. This is not a choice between her safety and your freedom. It is the same choice. The silence in the black cell corridor lasted long enough that Aura shifted her weight behind Jon, and Mira checked the corridor in both directions, and Arya looked at their father with the expression of a girl who had learned more about survival in the past weeks than anyone her age should have to learn, and was now watching her father learn something similar. Ned looked at Jon, and then he looked at Arya. Then he looked back at Jon with the expression of a man who has been given an argument he cannot refute, and is examining it for the flaw that would release him from its logic. He did not find the flaw. There will be a reckoning, Ned said quietly, for Sansa, a day when I come back for her properly. Yes, Jon said, but not tonight. Tonight we move. Ned Stark stepped out of his cell. The extraction moved well for exactly 11 minutes. Jon counted them afterward, in the way that men counted the intervals of things that went wrong. Backward from the moment of rupture, measuring the distance between when everything was working and when it stopped. 11 minutes from the cell block door closing behind them to the sound that changed everything. Not a shout, not an alarm bell, but the specific quiet sound of a patrol that had returned early, footsteps on the storage corridor stone, coming from the wrong direction at the wrong time, which meant either the distraction in Flea Bottom had burned shorter than Darrow had planned, or the secondary rotation Varys had warned about had been moved forward by a day, and Slint's intelligence had been better than anyone had credited. It did not matter which. The result was the same. Aura heard it first. She was at the group's rear, and her hearing had the quality of someone who had trained it the way other people trained a sword arm, deliberately and over years until it functioned at a level that bordered on the uncanny. She put her closed fist up, and the group stopped in the storage corridor's shadow with the immediate collective stillness of people who had practiced stopping. Two gold cloaks. Jon could hear them now, not close yet, coming from the stairwell at the corridor's northern end, moving with the regularity of a standard patrol rather than the urgency of a responding one, which meant they had not yet seen anything. They were simply early, or on a different schedule, or both. Jon made the calculation in the space of a single breath. The access point in the eastern wall was 15 feet behind them. The patrol was 30 feet ahead and closing. Going back to the access point meant passing through the open section of corridor, 8 feet that had been manageable in one direction, with a distraction active and a cleared patrol window, and now was a different proposition entirely, with two gold cloaks 25 feet away, and Ned Stark, who moved with the careful deliberateness of a man emerging from weeks in a cell between Jon and the wall. He did not go back. "Here," he said to Ned and Arya, and put them both behind the largest barrel stack in the shadow section, with the quiet authority of someone who had stopped asking whether people would follow and had started simply moving as though they would, which was, he had learned from Aldrich, the single most reliable method of making it true. To Mira, with them, she went without discussion. To Aura, beside him, which she was already, waist blades clear of their sheaths in the specific unhurried way of someone for whom the blades being present was simply the default condition of any situation that had become interesting. The gold cloaks came around the stairwell's base and into the corridor. They saw Jon and Aura immediately. There was not enough shadow this far from the barrel stack to prevent it, and Jon had not tried to prevent it because two gold cloaks confronting two apparently lost laborers in a storage corridor was a manageable problem, while two gold cloaks confronting two apparently lost laborers and also a recently escaped prisoner and his daughter was a different category of situation entirely. "Oi," said the first gold cloak with the particular tone of a man who is not yet alarmed but is proceeding toward alarm at a steady pace. He was young, broad, with the look of someone who had taken the City Watch position for its stability rather than its excitement, and was now experiencing more excitement than the stability had implied. His partner was older, quieter, already reaching a practiced hand toward the cudgel at his belt. "Lost," Jon said. He said it in the flat, slightly stupid register of someone embarrassed rather than guilty. A man who had wandered through a wrong door and was hoping the people who found him would find this more irritating than suspicious. "We were looking for the wine storage, for the kitchens. We were told it was through the east." "This isn't the wine storage," the older gold cloak said, with the tone of someone who has heard a great many explanations and has developed a reliable instinct for which ones were true. His eyes were moving past Jon and Aura to the shadows behind them, doing what experienced men's eyes did when something in a situation felt wrong before the conscious mind had processed why. Jon moved, not because the gold cloak had seen anything, because he was about to, and the window between about to see and has seen was the only window that mattered. He closed the distance in 2 steps and hit the older man with the pommel of his belt knife. Not Longclaw, which he still had not drawn, an instinct that was partly operational and partly something more complicated, in the precise location at the temple that produced unconsciousness rather than death. A technique he had learned from a Night's Watch ranger, who had learned it from a man who had learned it from a bravosi, and who had been very specific about the difference between the two outcomes and how much the location mattered. The older gold cloak went down. The younger one had his own cudgel out and was moving, and Aura was already inside his swing with both hands on his weapon arm, and her body turned in a way that used his own momentum to put him against the corridor wall with enough controlled force to produce the specific sound of breath, leaving a body involuntarily. She held him there with a forearm across his throat and looked at Jon with a question in her expression that was entirely professional and contained no sentiment in either direction. Jon looked at the young gold cloak, at the wide eyes above Aura's forearm, as the youth of the face, the terror that was entirely reasonable given the situation, and felt the full weight of being in a place where the choices were not between good and bad, but between bad and worse. "Sleep," Aura said to the young man. in a tone that was almost kind, and adjusted the forearm pressure in a way that cut the blood supply to the brain rather than the air to the lungs, which was faster and safer and left no permanent damage. The young Goldcloak's eyes closed with the involuntary surrender of a body overriding a mind's objection. She lowered him to the floor beside his partner with a care that was professional rather than sentimental. Damaged guards drew more immediate response than unconscious ones. When in damaged guards in the proximity of an escaped prisoner were a particular category of evidence that made the subsequent investigation considerably more focused. 2 minutes, Jon said. Maybe less. He went to the barrel stack. Ned was on his feet with the expression of a man who had watched two people rendered unconscious in the time it takes to draw a breath and was integrating this into his understanding of what his bastard son had become in the months since the wall. Arya was crouched beside the barrels with needle in her hand, and her eyes bright with the specific alertness of someone who had been ready to move, and was processing the fact that they had not needed to. "Move," Jon said. They moved. The eastern wall access point took 30 seconds to open. Mira was already at it, working from memory since she had closed it behind them on the approach, and the mechanism was now familiar. They went through in order. Arya first, Ned second, Mira third, Aura last. Jon pulling the access panel closed from the inside with the specific care of a man who understood that the time between closed and noticed open was the margin they were surviving on, the passage. Ned moved through it with the managed silence of a man who had spent his entire adult life in castles and understood stone acoustics. He was slower than the approach team had been. The weeks in the cell had done what weeks in a cell did to a body, and the crouch the passage required was harder on a man of Ned's height and current physical condition than it was on the others. Jon stayed directly behind him, and one hand occasionally at his father's shoulder. Not guiding, simply present, the physical equivalent of, "I am here, you are not alone, keep moving." Arya led. She moved through the passage with the same confident economy she had shown on the approach, lamp held low, root entirely resident in her body rather than her memory. And Jon watched his little sister navigate the Red Keep's hidden dark and felt something that he would not have had the vocabulary for at Castle Black, but that Westeros had been teaching him, section by painful section, to name. Not pride exactly, but the recognition of a person becoming themselves under conditions that would have unmade a different person, and the particular ache of that recognition when the person was 9 years old, and the conditions had been survivable only because she was exactly who she was. They reached the lower Warren access point in 18 minutes. Above them, King's Landing was reconfiguring. Jon could feel it in the stone. Not literally, but in the way that a man who had been paying attention to a situation's rhythm felt the rhythm change. The flea-bottom fire bells had stopped, which meant the distraction had burned out, which meant the Goldcloaks were cycling back toward their stations, which meant the window between the lower city's reconfiguration and the harbor approach was compressing with every minute they spent in the passage. He said none of this. He moved. The lower Warren came up around them with the familiar smell of flea-bottom's deep infrastructure, the particular damp of spaces beneath the city's inhabited layers, the ghost of 100 years of drainage. Arya extinguished the lamp. They moved by sound and touch through the Warren's lower section toward the upper entry point that connected to the lane behind the Tanners, and Jon counted time against the pace of movement and ran the numbers and did not like the result. "We're behind," he said quietly to Aura. "By how much?" "Enough that the harbor approach needs to be different," he said. "Darrow has the boat at the second bell. It is past the second bell." "Darrow waits," Aura said, with the certainty of someone who knew exactly what she meant and exactly how reliable the thing she meant was. "Until the third bell, or until he hears something that tells him waiting is no longer viable. Aldrich's standing instruction on every extraction. And if something has told him waiting is no longer viable, then we find another boat," Aura said. "Or we don't. But we don't solve that problem until we've solved this one." They came up through the flea-bottom lane into the autumn air. The city had a different quality now. The distractions aftermath still moving through the watch's communication structure, patrols redistributing, the specific organized confusion of a force responding to something that had concluded and trying to restore its baseline. This was simultaneously better and worse than an active distraction. Better because no one was running toward a fire. Worse because men restoring their baseline were more likely to notice anomalies. Jon assessed the group. Ned was upright, moving, functional. Slower than operational preference, but faster than the cell had given Jon reason to hope. He had said nothing since the storage corridor, and he was not a man who spent words when action was required, which was one of the things Jon had always respected about him, and which was now specifically useful. Arya was reading the street with the flea-bottom natives' quick intelligence, checking sightlines, noting the positions of two gold cloaks visible at the lane's far end. Mira had the merchant papers and the specific loose-limbed posture of someone about to become someone else in whatever way the next 30 seconds required. The two gold cloaks at the lane's end were not patrolling. They were standing with the settled quality of men who had been told to hold a position, which was different from patrolling because it meant someone had made a specific decision about this specific location. Slint. Najan felt the information land with the cold clarity of a situation resolved into its actual shape. The secondary rotation had not simply been moved forward. Janos Slint had anticipated the harbor approach. Not specifically, not Jon Snow and the wolf pack, but generically. A rescue attempt, if it came, would exit toward the water, and the logical exit toward the water from Flea Bottom ran through the Mudgate corridor, and Slint had placed men accordingly. Not many men, two visible, which suggested perhaps two more at angles Jon couldn't see from his current position. Slint had been working with incomplete intelligence. He'd been told an attempt might come, not when or how many or which route. 4 men on a harbor approach was a hedge bet, not a response. 4 men was also 4 men. Varys said the Street of Steel access ran parallel to the Mudgate corridor. Mira said quietly, not quite a question. A block north, Jon said. Longer route to the harbor. And 4 men become 2, Mira said, meaning the Street of Steel approach only required passing the Mudgate corridor's near end, which the current Gold Cloak positions did not cover. The timing is what it is, Aura said, with the flat pragmatism of someone who had learned that the timing was always what it was. We move north. We come to the harbor from the Street of Steel end. We find the boat, or we find another boat. Jon looked at his father. Ned was watching the 2 gold cloaks at the lane's end, with the expression of a man recognizing the shape of a situation he had been in before. The shape of a situation where the people around him were about to take risks that were partly his fault. Jon, Ned said quietly. Not now, Jon said. You left the wall for... Father? Jon met his father's eyes in the alley dark, in the amber-filtered nighttime glow of King's Landing, filtering between buildings, and held the look long enough to communicate what the moment did not have time for in words. That the accounting could come later, that there was a later to come too, that the argument about vows and duty and what he had broken and what breaking it had meant would be available to them on the other side of the harbor if they moved now. Not now. Ned was quiet for a moment, and then he nodded once with the specific quality of a Stark nod. The acknowledgement that this was not agreement, but a postponement of disagreement, which was a form of trust. They went north. The Street of Steel was quieter than the Mudgate approach. Craftsman's District at night, the forge fires banked, the metal smell present even in the cold air, the particular silence of tools resting. They moved through it in the merchant configuration. Mira ahead with the papers and the posture, Jon and Ned behind as hired muscle, Arya between them with her cloak hood up and needle hidden under it, Aura a half-block back as eyes. They were 200 feet from the harbor approach when Sir Island Payne stepped out of the shadow of a blacksmith's awning and blocked the street. Jon had not thought about Sir Island Payne. He had thought about the gold cloaks, about Slint's secondary rotation, about the patrol timing and the access points and the boat at the second bell. He had not thought about the King's justice, the silent, tongueless executioner who had carried out every sentence the Iron Throne had issued for 15 years. Standing in a side street near the harbor on a night when a rescue attempt was in motion. He was not here because Slint had placed him. He was here, Jon understood in the specific clear way that terrible things were sometimes understood, because Varys was not the only person in King's Landing who had been expecting someone to make this attempt. Cersei Lannister had been expecting it too. Sir Elin Payne carried ice, his father's greatsword, confiscated with Ned's arrest, in the Stark ancestral blade that had been in the family for 4 centuries, forged from Valyrian steel and named for the cold of the north it embodied. It was in Sir Alan's hands, and the sight of it produced in Ned Stark a sound Jon had never heard from his father and hoped never to hear again. A sound that was not quite speech and not quite grief, but was both of those things compressed into a single involuntary utterance. Jon stepped forward and drew Longclaw. Valyrian steel met Valyrian steel for perhaps the second or third time in a generation. It was not a common event in a world where fewer than 200 such blades existed. And the sound it produced was different from the sound of common steel. Not louder, not more resonant, but cleaner, as though the metal recognized itself in the other and acknowledged the meeting with a purity of tone that lesser materials couldn't achieve. Sir Island Payne was not a swordsman in the conventional sense. He was something more specific and in some ways more dangerous. An executioner who had spent 15 years performing a single function with absolute efficiency. He did not fight. He ended. His technique with ice was built entirely around the delivery of final, conclusive force. The angle of the swing calibrated for completion, not engagement, not prolonged exchange, not the back and forth of swordsmanship, but the single committed motion of a man who had learned that the only sword stroke that mattered was the last one. Jon was not an executioner. He was a ranger, a bastard trained in Winterfell's yard by a master-at-arms who had understood that bastards needed to be better than those they stood beside, trained further by the Wall's Rangers in the conditions of the actual North, carrying Longclaw with the muscle memory of a blade that had been his for long enough to feel like an extension of thought rather than an extension of arm. He was faster. Not dramatically, not by the margin of a hero in a bard's song, but by the specific functional margin of a younger man with a lighter blade, and the advantage of having been the one who initiated contact rather than responded to it. Ice was a great sword. Longer reach, greater force, devastating in a single committed swing, and considerably slower between swings than a bastard sword in the hands of someone who knew how to use it. Now, Jon did not try to match force. He worked the angles, the way the Wall's Rangers had worked terrain, using what was there rather than fighting what wasn't. He absorbed Sir Ilan's first swing on a deflection that sent ice scraping along Longclaw's blade, rather than meeting it direct. The Valyrian steel tolerating this in the way that Valyrian steel tolerated most things. Without degradation, without flaw, the edge remaining what it was, regardless of what it was asked to do. The second swing he stepped inside entirely. It was the move that worked against great swords in confined spaces. The counterintuitive movement toward the blade's deadly end rather than away from it, closing the distance until the weapon's length became a liability rather than an advantage, until Sir Elin Payne was too close to swing and not equipped, and by 15 years of a single specialized function to shift into the close quarters work that the distance now required. Jon hit him with Longclaw's pommel at the jaw. Sir Elin Payne went down, not dead. Jon checked with the pragmatic thoroughness of someone who needed the answer immediately. Breathing, unconscious, his grip releasing ice as he fell so that the great sword clattered on the street of steel's cobblestones, with a sound that was, in the specific quiet of this street at this hour, considerably louder than Jon would have preferred. Ned was beside him before the echo finished. He was looking at ice on the cobblestones with an expression that was complex in the specific way that 4 centuries of family history made things complex. The sword was not simply steel and Valyrian magic. It was everything the Starks had been and done and borne and promised. It was his father's sword and his father's father's sword. It was the North-made metal. He picked it up. He stood in the street of steel with ice in his hands and Longclaw still bare in Jon's and the king's justice, unconscious at their feet. And he looked at his bastard son, and the expression on his face was something Jon did not have a name for in any language he spoke. "We need to move," Aura said from behind them, with the flat, precise urgency of someone who had heard a very loud sound on a quiet street and was running the numbers on how long before someone came to investigate. They moved. The harbor was 200 feet, then 100. Then the smell of the water was real and immediate, and the Mudgate's harbor approach opened before them, and Jon could see the boat. Darrow's boat, still there, still waiting, the massive Carthian visible at the prow like a promise kept. And he understood that they were going to make it, that the numbers worked, that the margin was thin, but it was there. They were 30 feet from the dock when the arrows came, two of them from the harbor wall's upper parapet. Not a volley, not a coordinated attack, but the specific quality of two archers who had been told to watch the harbor approach and were now watching something that matched their description of what to watch for. The first arrow went wide, the second did not. Jon felt it rather than saw it, the specific dynamics of someone beside him lurching, the involuntary sound, the change in weight distribution that said a body had just been asked to manage something it hadn't planned for. He turned. Ned Stark had an arrow in his left shoulder, not through the shoulder, not the immediately fatal placement, not the lung or the heart, but the shoulder, the left one, the muscle and bone, driven in at an angle by a parapet archer who had been shooting at range in poor light, which was why it was the shoulder and not something worse. Ned was still standing. He had ice in his right hand and he was standing, and he was looking at Jon with an expression that was, even now, even here, less frightened than resolute. "Go," Jon said to Aura. "Get him to the boat." "Jon!" "The archers are on the parapet," Jon said. "They need to not be. Go." Aura assessed this for 1 second. The parapet, the distance, the angle, were the two archers already knocking second shots. And then she went, one arm around Ned's right side, moving him toward the dock with the controlled urgency of someone managing an injured principal without letting the injury become the speed. Arya was already running for the boat. Mira was already on the dock. Jon looked up at the harbor wall's parapet with Longclaw in his hand, and the specific clarity of a man who has reduced a situation to its single necessary element, and he ran toward the wall. The harbor wall's parapet stairs were inside a guard tower at the dock's northern end, a squat, functional structure of the kind that King's Landing produced in its utilitarian moments, built for access rather than elegance. A single stairwell winding upward through the tower's interior, with a door at the base that was unlocked because harbor wall towers in a city at theoretical internal peace were not designed to be defended from inside. Jon went through the door and up the stairs at a run. The tower's interior was close and dark, and smelled of salt and old stone, and the specific mustiness of a space that was occupied intermittently rather than continuously. His boots on the stairs produced sound he could not prevent and did not try to. Speed was more valuable than silence now. The margin between the archers knocking their second shots and the dock being in range again was the only calculation that mattered, and that margin was measured in seconds rather than the comfortable minutes that silent approach required. He came through the parapet door and into the open air. The first archer was already turned toward him, had heard the boots on the stairs, had the instinct of a man whose position had just been compromised, was swinging around with a half-drawn arrow that had not yet reached full draw. Jon covered the distance between the door and the archer in 4 steps and hit him with the controlled force of someone who needed the man incapacitated rather than dead. And the archer went down against the parapet wall with the involuntary cooperation of a body that had received a significant impact to the head. The second archer was further along the parapet, 20 feet, already at full draw, arrow pointed not at Jon but at the dock below, where Aura was moving Ned toward the boat's gangplank. Jon threw Longclaw. He had never done this in any context that was not practice. He had practiced it because a wall ranger named Corin Halfhand had told him once that the only time you were truly disarmed was when you believed you were, and that a sword in the air was still a sword, and that the specific terror of a Valyrian steel blade spinning toward a man at close range was itself a form of argument that most men found comprehensively persuasive. Longclaw hit the second archer flat, pommel first, not edge, because Jon had not thrown it with killing intent, and the rotation at 20 feet was not precise enough to control the outcome beyond the general category of impact, and hit him in the chest with enough force to break the arrow's release and send the shot high and wide, clattering off the harbor wall's outer stonework somewhere over the water. The second archer sat down hard against the parapet and looked at Jon with the expression of a man who had just been hit by a flying sword, and was taking a moment to process whether this was actually his life. Jon crossed to him in 3 steps, recovered Longclaw from the parapet stone where it had fallen, and looked at the archer with the specific directness of a man communicating something that did not require elaboration. The archer did not elaborate. He sat very still. Jon looked over the parapet. The dock below was clear. Darrow's boat was pulling away from the dock with the controlled urgency of a crew that had been told to move the moment the last person was aboard. And the last person, Jon could see Aura at the stern, could see Arya's small shape amidships. Ash could see Ned sitting against the mast housing with ice across his knees and his right hand pressed to the arrow shaft still in his left shoulder. The last person was aboard. Jon ran back down the stairs. The dock was 30 feet of open cobblestone between the tower's base and the water, and the boat was 8 feet from the dock's edge and moving, and Jon ran the 30 feet and hit the dock's edge and jumped with the specific committed energy of a man who has decided the water was not an acceptable alternative and trusted the jump to be enough. It was enough. He caught the boat's stern rail with both hands and took the impact against the hull with his arms in the side of his body in a way that would produce bruising in places he hadn't yet inventoried. And Darrow reached over the rail and pulled him aboard with one hand in the manner of a man lifting something he found only slightly inconvenient. Jon lay on the boat's deck for approximately 4 seconds, looking up at King's Landing's night sky, amber with the city's torchlight, the Red Keep's towers visible above the roofline, the harbor wall receding as Darrow's crew worked the oars with the focused efficiency of people who had been told what urgency meant and had taken the instructions seriously. Then he stood up. Ned was against the mast housing, with Aura crouched beside him, doing what Aura did with injuries, assessing with the quick, thorough practicality of someone who had dealt with many of them and understood that the time between injury and treatment was a variable with consequences. And the arrow was still in. Removing it on the boat was not preferable, but the shaft was stable, the bleeding managed, and Ned's color was better than Jon had feared from a man who had spent weeks in a cell and then walked through the Red Keep sewers and fought his way to a harbor. Through and through, Jon asked Aura. Shoulder muscle, Aura said. Missed the joint. He'll have full use if it's cleaned and closed properly. She glanced up at Jon. He needs a maester. He'll have one, Jon said. He was already looking ahead, past the harbor's mouth, past the Blackwater Rush's broad, dark current, toward the narrow sea that waited beyond it. The Salted Crow was anchored outside the harbor mouth as planned, as Vesa had been paid to ensure, her outline visible against the sea's darker dark as a darker shape that meant passage and distance, and the specific mercy of open water between a man and the people who wanted him dead. He looked at Arya. She was sitting amidships with her knees drawn up and needle still in her hand, watching the harbor wall recede with the expression of someone who was allowing herself incrementally to believe that the thing she was experiencing was real. The cut on her jaw caught the harbor's reflected light. She had said almost nothing since the granary roof, had moved and followed and acted with the precision that the situation required, and had not spent words that the situation didn't have room for. And now, in the boat's rocking quiet, she was doing what came after sustained alertness in people who had been alone for a long time. She was allowing herself to feel the weight of what she had been carrying. Jon sat down beside her. She didn't look at him. She looked at the receding city, at King's Landing, pulling away across the Blackwater's dark water, at its lights diminishing without diminishing fast enough, at the Red Keep's towers that still held Sansa somewhere inside them, awake or asleep, knowing or not knowing. We left her, Arya said. Yes, Jon said. She doesn't know we were here. No. Arya was quiet for a moment. The oars worked in their rhythm. The water moved. She would have wanted to know, Arya said. Not an accusation. A fact, stated with the honesty of someone who had learned that facts needed stating even when they were painful. It's because the alternative was a lie of omission that became a lie of commission the moment you chose to maintain it. Yes, Jon said. She would have. He paused. We'll come back for her. Arya turned and looked at him then, the full weight of her attention, the look she gave to things she was deciding whether to believe. Promise, she said. Jon held her look. In another life, in the life he had left when he walked away from the wall, He would have been careful with this word, would have measured it against what he could guarantee, against what the world's unpredictability made promisable. He had been taught by a father who was now sitting against the massed housing with a Lannister arrow in his shoulder and his ancestral sword across his knees, that promises meant something. Or that the weight of a word given was the weight of a word kept, or the weight of a word broken, and that both outcomes followed you. He said it anyway. Promise, he said. Arya looked at him for another moment. Then she put her head against his shoulder with the deliberateness of someone choosing to trust rather than simply falling into trust. And Jon put his arm around her, and they sat in the boat's rocking quiet as King's Landing fell away behind them into the Blackwater's dark. At the mast housing, Ned Stark had his eyes open. He was watching his bastard son and his youngest daughter sitting together in the stern of a stolen boat on the Blackwater Rush, with King's Landing receding behind them. And his expression was the expression of a man who had built his life on a certain understanding of honor and duty and the correct way to move through a world that required both, and who was now in the process of having that understanding expanded in ways he had not anticipated and could not yet fully process. Jon met his father's eyes across the boat's length. Ned said nothing. The arrow in his shoulder and the weeks in the cell and the city he was leaving behind and the daughter he was leaving in it were all present in his expression simultaneously. And Jon did not try to resolve any of it, did not offer comfort or argument or the pragmatic reassurance that things would be managed. He simply held his father's look across the dark water with the specific steadiness of a man who had made choices he could not unmake and was prepared to account for them when accounting was what the moment required. Ned nodded. Not forgiveness. Forgiveness required a conversation that neither of them had had yet, and that both of them knew was coming, and that the narrow sea and Essos and whatever came after would provide the context for. But acknowledgement. The nod of a man who recognized what his son had done, and what it had cost him, and what it would continue to cost him, and who was, despite himself, despite every instinct that told him the Night's Watch vow was sacred, and abandoning it was a wound to something fundamental. Grateful. The Salted Crow was close now. Jon could hear Vis's crew moving on the deck, could see the rope ladders being lowered over the side, could smell the familiar composite of fish and rope, and the narrow sea that meant passage east and away, and the specific kind of safety that was really only distance. Darrow brought the boat alongside with the competence of a man who had done this in worse conditions and considered this particular mooring entirely within normal parameters. Aldrich appeared at the rail above them. He looked down at the boat's occupants with the comprehensive assessment of a man taking inventory. Jon, Arya, Ned with his arrow and his ancestral sword, Aura, Mira, among the rest of the extraction team, and his expression moved through several things in quick succession before settling on the particular quality of a leader who has received an outcome that was more expensive than planned and was filing the expense under acceptable rather than unacceptable. Your father looks like a man who needs a maester, Aldrich called down. He needs a maester, Jon confirmed. We have something better, Aldrich said. We have Cass, who has been removing arrows from people for 15 years and whose technique is not elegant but has an excellent survival record. A pause. Get him up here. They got Ned up the rope ladder with the careful management of a man with one functional arm and the stubborn refusal to be managed more than necessary. Which was, Jon thought, in watching his father climb with his right arm and his jaw set and ice somehow still in his grip. Exactly the most Ned Stark way to board a ship while injured. As Ned came over the rail and Cass materialized from somewhere, with the focused expression of a man who had already identified the nature of the problem and was preparing its solution, Jon pulled himself up last and stood on the Salted Crow's deck and looked back at King's Landing across the Blackwater's dark expanse. The city was lit and distant and ongoing. It would wake in the morning and find two unconscious gold cloaks in a storage corridor and an empty cell, and the King's Justice on the cobblestones of the Street of Steel with a lump at his jaw and no sword. And the machinery of Lannister response would begin its grinding motion. Ravens to every lord. A gold cloaks doubled at every gate. Cersei's cold fury moving through the small council like weather moving through a valley. finding every low point and filling it. Jon Snow's name would be spoken in that machinery, spoken alongside Ned Stark's name, alongside the Wolfpack's description, alongside the operational details that Slint would reconstruct from the evidence and present to the Queen with the particular quality of a man reporting a failure that he was framing as someone else's. Varys would be asked what he knew. Varys would tell the Queen precisely what he chose to tell her, which would be precise and complete and entirely true, and would nonetheless not contain everything. Somewhere in the Red Keep's upper levels, Sansa Stark would wake in the morning and go through the motions of her captive life, the careful words, the managed expression, the slow accumulation of survival's education, not knowing that her father was alive on a ship in the Blackwater Rush, not knowing that her sister had been in the city, not knowing that a bastard brother had crossed the narrow sea and hired wolves and come through the sewers and brought them out. She would not know yet, but she would know. Jon had promised. He turned away from King's Landing and faced east, where the narrow sea opened in the darkness beyond the harbor mouth, and Essos waited on the other side of it with whatever came next. With Aldrich's accounting of what the job had cost, with Ned's reckoning about vows and duty, and the specific complicated debt a father owed a son who had broken sacred oaths to save his life. Wiped with the question of what a Stark and Essos did next, in a world where the War of the Five Kings was beginning its grinding motion, and the North was calling, and Sansa was still in the lion's den. Arya appeared at his elbow. "What do we do now?" she asked. Jon looked at the narrow sea, at the darkness opening ahead of the Salted Crow as Vis's crew ran up the sails, and the wind caught them with the specific sound of canvas under pressure. Purposeful, directional, the sound of a vessel committed to a heading. "We go east," he said. "We regroup. We plan." He paused. "And then we come back." Arya was quiet for a moment. "With the wolves?" she asked. Jon looked back over his shoulder, at the wolf pack on the deck behind them, at Aldrich checking the sail trim with the practical attention of a man who was already thinking about the next thing, which at Cass working on Ned's shoulder with the careful competence of someone whose 15 years of experience were being applied in real time, at Aura standing at the prow with her face to the east wind and her blades sheathed for the first time since King's Landing, at Edwin coiling rope with the quiet efficiency of someone who had recalibrated his opinion of something and was still working out the implications. "With the wolves," Jon said. The Salted Crow passed through the harbor mouth and onto the open narrow sea, and King's Landing shrank behind them into the amber glow of a city that was already preparing its response, already sharpening its instruments, already writing the name Jon Snow into the ledger of things that required settling. In the north, ravens were moving between castles. Robb Stark was raising his banners. The War of the Five Kings was finding its shape, and beyond the wall, in the ancient dark of the world's far edge, something that had been patient for 8,000 years was becoming less patient, its cold purpose moving southward through the long night with the inexorable steadiness of a tide that answered to nothing alive. Ned Stark had his eyes open against Cass's work, ice across his knees, watching his bastard son stand at the stern rail, watching King's Landing disappear. The expression on his face was the expression of a man who had survived something he had not expected to survive, and who was already beginning the slow, complicated work of understanding what that survival meant. What it required of him, what it required of his son, what it required of the North and the war, and the darkness coming from beyond the wall. And a master in some Essosi city would close Ned's wound. The arrow would come out, the shoulder would mend in the imperfect way that field-treated wounds mended. Functional but not unmarked, carrying the evidence of what had happened the way all survived things carried evidence. Somewhere in Flea Bottom, in the warrens where Arya had kept her vigil, a young boy who ran messages for a certain bald man in purple robes would find no girl in the granary at dawn and would report this to his employer with the careful accuracy that his employer rewarded and its absence punished. Varys would receive the report. He would file it in the part of his considerable intelligence that he maintained for things whose significance he understood completely and whose implications he was not yet ready to act on. He would go to the small council meeting that morning and say the appropriate things in the appropriate register, and note with his characteristic gentle precision that the investigation into Lord Stark's disappearance was proceeding, and that he had every confidence in Commander Slint's thoroughness. He would say this with a straight face. He was very good at straight faces. In the Red Keep's training yard, a small girl with short hair would watch the morning's drill from the shadows of the stable entrance, and would think about a conversation she'd had with a water dancer from Bravos, who had told her that the first step was not the sword. The first step was seeing. She would watch the night's drill, and she would see, and she would remember. And she would continue the patient work of survival that was teaching her more than any dancing master could about the cost of living in a world that did not intend for her to. Sansa Stark would wake in her room and look out her window at the city below and breathe through the managed stillness she was learning to wear like armor. And she would not know, not yet, that somewhere on the narrow sea a ship was carrying her father away from the place that had been killing him, and that a bastard brother who loved her had said he was coming back. She would find out. Jon had promised. The wind off the narrow sea was cold with the specific quality of autumn moving toward winter. Not the summer end warmth that made the crossing easy, but the first real edge of the season's intent, the preview of what was coming for everyone in every direction. The cold that did not care about the Game of Thrones or the War of the Five Kings, or the rescue that had just been accomplished, or the ones that still needed to come. Winter was coming. It always was. Jon Snow stood at the stern of the Salted Crow, with Longclaw on his back, and his father alive behind him, and his sister at his side, and the wolf pack on the deck and King's Landing, shrinking to a glow on the western horizon. And he thought about the wall, about the ancient pressurized quiet of it, about Ghost's red eyes at the gate, about the letter he had left for Mormont that said everything and asked forgiveness for none of it. He thought about what came next. Essos first, Ned's wound, Arya's safety, the pack's accounting. Then the question of how a Stark returned to the North when the North was already at war. Then Sansa. Then the larger thing, the thing that all of this was taking place in the shadow of, the thing that no rescue and no war and no Game of Thrones could ultimately postpone. The cold coming down from beyond the wall with 8,000 years of patience and an army that did not tire and did not feel and did not stop. There was so much still to do. Jon Snow faced east into the narrow sea's cold wind and let King's Landing disappear behind him. And somewhere in the dark water between the world he had left and the world he was moving toward, in the thin cold air of an autumn night on the open sea, he felt the particular quality of something beginning, not ending, not resolving, not the closure of a story, but the opening of the next stage of one. The way the wall's gate opening led not to safety, but to everything beyond the wall, with a real and unmanaged world where every choice had weight and every cost was paid in full. The wolves were with him. His father was alive. His sister was beside him. The game was not over. It was never over. But the pieces had moved and the board was different. And somewhere in Cersei Lannister's King's Landing, a queen was waking to find that the man she had caged had slipped the cage, and that the bastard she had ignored had proved more dangerous than the lord she had feared, and that the name Jon Snow was going to require a different kind of attention going forward. The narrow sea opened ahead of the Salted Crow, without mercy or sentiment, indifferent to everything aboard her, carrying them east into whatever the world had prepared for people who had done the impossible and survived it and were now required to do the next impossible thing. Winter still came, but so did wolves. What Jon Snow did on the Blackwater Rush was not the act of a hero. Heroes exist in songs, and songs require clean lines. The brave man, the just cause, the moment of triumph. What Jon did was messier and more honest than that. He broke a sacred vow, hired criminals, crawled through sewers, made a deal with the most dangerous spy master in the world, left his sister in captivity, and carried his father out of a cell at the cost of things he could not yet fully calculate. Westeros does not reward this with songs. Not immediately. It rewards it with consequences, with Cersei's cold attention, with Robb's war finding a new dimension, with the wall's long memory of a vow abandoned, with Sansa still in the lion's den waiting for a promise to be kept. But Ned Stark breathed, and breathing, in a world that had been specifically organized to stop him, was not nothing. It was, in the arithmetic of a world where good men died first and honor was a trap, and winter came for everyone, the one irreducible thing that all the scheming and cruelty and political machinery had failed to prevent. The wolves ran east. The game continued. And somewhere beyond the wall, patient as geology, the long night's cold pressed southward, waiting for the moment when all the small human dramas, playing out in the world's warm middle, finally ran out of room to postpone the reckoning that had been coming since the first winter. Jon Snow would face it. He had learned finally how.